Hello and welcome back to another stream of Skievers Art of Book Club. So hope we're all doing well today. When we last left off, Kiva was about to do the second trial by ordeal. But let's do some cookie stuff first and then we'll get into it. Look at all this money. Look at all those cookies. 70 billion. Hellos. Wonder how many of those? 3. That's fun. Well, let's get into it. We won't dilly-dally. And for those of you who are following along at home, we are currently reading chapter 21. And I am reading 2 chapters at a time, so feel free to follow along at home if you have a copy of the books. I'll just plug. Oops, I forgot to turn my phone on silent. And let's get into it. Chapter 21. Kiva was certain she was going to throw up in front of everyone. Either that or she was going to pass out. She wondered if she'd still have to face the trial by fire if she were unconscious. Would it matter if the end result was to be the same? Surely there was no way Kiva could survive what was ahead, amulet or no. She remembered what Mott had said just yesterday. Did you know Grendel's been asked to stoke the second furnace? Rook made the request himself. Kiva hadn't even questioned it, wholly believing that it must be in preparation for the rising numbers of dead. But now, as she approached the crematorium and tried to stave off the full body shakes assailing her frame, she didn't know whether it was good or bad that she hadn't dwelled on Mort's words, never once considering what they could have meant for her. This was worse than a wooden pile. So much worse. And just as Kiva had known there was no sign of her family, no sign of the rebels, she truly was on her own. The prisoners parted like waves as Bones led Nari and Kiva toward the entrance of the stone building, where Warden Rook stood with 3 other guards and Grendel. The crematorium worker was looking at the ground, holding both of her elbows and clearly wishing she was anywhere but the center of attention right now. Kiva wondered what was going through her head, and if she too dreaded what was about to happen. As a woman in her early 30s, Grendel had been sent to Zalandor for arson, so the guards had amused themselves by placing her in charge of the crematorium, but not before making sure to welcome her. Over half of Grendel's body was covered in burn scars from what they'd done, and she'd only survived because Kiva had worked tirelessly day and night to keep her from death. She, like many prisoners, owed Kiva her life, and now it looked like she was about to be ordered to repay that debt by helping to kill her. Warden Rook stood tall and proud beside Grendel, his black leather uniform polished to perfection, as always. He showed no emotion as he beheld Kiva, his stance enough that she knew he'd meant what he'd said after her first ordeal. She would find no help from him. Whatever supposed protection he'd afforded her in the last decade was now gone. Kiva Meriden, Rook said, in a deep carrying voice, as she approached. Today you will face your second ordeal, the trial by fire. Do you have any last words? Prince Deverick had made the same offer to Kiva 2 weeks earlier, and just like then, she held her tongue. Partly because she didn't want to provoke the warden, and partly because she didn't want to vomit all over her own feet. Instead, she looked out at the crowd, feeling their energy. Some of the nearest prisoners sneered, their resentment toward her and the trials palpable. Others were invigorated, as if the prospect of this ordeal thrilled them, whatever the outcome might be. Finally, there were those who stared with wonder clear on their faces. If she could survive, they could survive. If she could go free, then maybe one day they could too. She was their hope, their faith in a different, brighter future. But Kiva was a long way from success, and she was reminded of this when she caught Cresta's hazel stare, the rebel leader staring with her arms crossed, her expression all but screaming that Kiva had better survive or else. "Very well," Rook said when she remained silent. To the amassed crowd he said, Given the nature of this task, you will not be bearing witness today. However, you'll stay here until a verdict has been reached, and only then will you be released back to your work." Kiva felt a ripple of discontent from the prisoners, enough for her worry to expand beyond herself for a split second. This many inmates in one place was a recipe for disaster, the perfect breeding ground for a riot to break out. The guards would get the upper hand, they always did, but the casualties. Kiva swallowed and forced away her fears. There was more anticipation than anger, more excitement than outrage, indicating that, for now, they were safe. Or at least, everyone but Kiva was safe. "Follow me," the warden ordered, turning on his heel and striding through the stone door into the darkened building beyond. Nari grabbed Kiva's arm and ushered her forward. To the onlookers her action would appear pushy, but what they didn't see was how gentle her touch was, and how the encouraging squeeze of her fingers a silent assurance that everything would be all right. The kindness almost brought tears to Kiva's eyes, and she wondered if this would be the last human contact she ever felt. If things didn't go as planned, Mott's waxy mixture would be almost useless in what she was about to face, meaning that Princess Mirren's amulet was all Kiva had. If it didn't work... Stop, Kiva told herself. She couldn't allow herself to doubt, not when so much was at stake. She would survive. She would survive. Passing the last of the prisoners, Kiva kept her eyes downcast, unwilling to risk spotting Tip or Jaren in the crowd. She needed to remember their confidence, not see their pale, anxious faces. She also sought to avoid the pitying looks from inmates she'd treated over the years, as if they believed this was the last they'd see of her, as if they knew she was walking to her death. "Focus, Kiva," Nari murmured. "Forget everyone and everything." Kiva inhaled deeply and then exhaled again, just as they approached a large doorway. She stole a final glance upward before stepping inside, noting that the only one of the chimneys was smoking, while the other, belonging to the second furnace, was still and silent, waiting, it seemed, for Kiva. With her heart pounding in her ears, Kiva relied on Nari's touch to steady her as they entered the stone building, her eyes needing a moment to adjust to the darker space within. Aluminium beacons were affixed to the walls, lighting the room enough for Kiva to soon take in the empty antechamber. She'd been in here before, only a handful of times, throughout the years, but never with such dread pulling in her stomach. For the trial by fire, as noted in the Book of Law, you're to face an elemental task involving flames, Warden Rook said, his hands clasped behind his back. Bones leaned against the wall near him, looking bored, while the other three guards were more alert, as if waiting for Kiva to snap and attack them all. Grendel and Nari stood like sentinels, the former still holding herself as if she'd rather be anywhere else, and the latter continuing to offer silent support. "The crematorium keeper has been gracious enough to help prepare your task," Rook went on, tipping his head toward Grendel. "Perhaps it's best if she explains what you're to do." Grendel's neck jerked upward as she turned, frightened eyes first to Rook and then, at his pointed nod, to Kiva. The woman licked her scarred lips and said in a rasping voice, her throat having been damaged beyond repair when she'd received her wounds, "I've cleared out the second furnace for you. It's ready to be lit once you're in there." Kiva swayed, and only Nari's tightening grip kept her from falling. When Grendel said no more, Rook made an impatient sound and continued for her. As you know, Zalandor's fires are built for mass cremation, turning bodies to ash within 2 to 3 hours, but it takes less than 5 minutes before the flames penetrate through flesh and into organs and bones. We've taken all this into account and have decided to be generous with your trial. We'll turn the furnace off after 10 minutes, and if you're still alive, we'll consider you to have passed this ordeal. That was what he considered generous? Nari's grip turned bruising, and Kiva realized it was because she was beginning to audibly hyperventilate, and the guard was wordlessly telling her to get a hold of herself. That was difficult, when stars were dotting her vision and panic was clutching at her chest, her body going into survival mode without the trial having even begun. A jab of Nari's fingernails had Kiva wincing, a quick hint of pain giving her something to focus on, something to pull her back from her free-falling mind. "Do you understand your task?" Wardenrook asked, his dark eyes fixed on hers. As before, there was no emotion on his face, as if he had no preference whether she lived or died. Either way, she was an inconvenience. Another prick of Nari's fingernails, and Kiva managed to croak out, "Yes." "Good," said Rook. "Then follow me." Kiva wasn't sure if she'd be able to move another step. She couldn't feel her legs, her body numb. Maybe that was for the best, if Merrin's amulet didn't work. If Mott's mixture offered no protection, she didn't want to feel the lick of flames tearing at her flesh, her skin beginning to peel away, bubbling and melting from her bones, her... "Kiva!" Nari hissed, her nails digging in much harder this time, enough for Kiva to lurch forward after Rook and his entourage. Kiva sent a grateful look at Nari, who she was aware must be able to feel her entire body quaking against hers. The guard looked back with such a confident, reassuring expression that Kiva was able to draw a full breath into her lungs. Nari wouldn't be offering comfort if she didn't believe Kiva could survive. Placing one foot in front of the other and thinking of nothing but the crest dangling from her neck and the wax coating her skin, Kiva shuffled after the warden, noting that Grendel looked as traumatized by all of this as Kiva felt. They moved past a large closed door that had an immense amount of heat rippling from it. The acrid tang of smoke mixed with burning flesh and hair sticking to Kiva's nostrils and making her struggle to keep from dry retching. She held her breath as they continued down a long hallway, refusing to consider what had been beyond that door. Or who. "Here we are," Rook said, when they reached the far end of the building and came to a stop before another closed door. This one wasn't giving off any heat, though Kiva knew that was only temporary. The warden waved his hand at Bones, who stepped forward and heaved the door open with a grunt of effort. It was made of thick stone and wide enough for a cartload of bodies to be sent directly into the room beyond, just as the hallway they were standing in was large enough to allow for such transport. A high-pitched buzzing sound started in Kiva's ears as the warden stepped into the room and indicated for her to follow. If not for Nari tugging her in, and the 3 guards that remained in the hallway behind her, Kiva might have considered making a run for it. "I can survive this," Kiva told herself, her inner voice wobbling in the face of what stood before her, and yet she was determined to fight, to live until the very end. "I will survive this." Tremors racked her frame, but Kiva made herself look around the sizable room. She now halted in the center of it. Like the door, both of the walls and the floors were made of thick stone. The exposed surfaces charred by decades of use. 3 of the walls were interrupted by sealed metal grates, which Kiva didn't inspect for long, all too aware of their purpose. The arched stone ceiling tapered high above her head and lifted into a chute that she knew poked out the top of the crematorium as the second chimney. It would soon be smoking, just like the first. 10 minutes, Kiva Meriden, Warden Rook said, moving back toward the door and jerking his head for Nari to follow. "Let's see if you can defy fate a second time." Kiva wondered if he thought his words were bolstering, but all they did was leave an ashy taste in her mouth, like her body already knew what was coming. "See you in 10 minutes, Nari said firmly as she unlatched her hand, her amber eyes locked on Kiva's and alight with forceful emotion, as if she were trying to share all her strength, all her confidence that Kiva would still be alive at the end of those 10 minutes. The moment Nari's touch was gone, Kiva wanted it back. There was nothing steadying her anymore, nothing keeping her from falling. "Slow breaths," Nari whispered, too soft for Rook to hear, with him already waiting by the door. "And stay low." Kiva could barely comprehend the guard's parting instructions, sheer terror rising up and constricting her ribcage. The amulet, she reminded herself. Trust the amulet. That was all well and good, but it also meant trusting the princess, when Kiva still despised everything she represented. The sound of the door sealing shut echoed around the room, and Kiva spun toward it, a surge of panic unleashing within her. "No, come back!" she cried in desperation, running to the stone barrier and thumping her hands against it. "Please!" It didn't open. Smoke tickled Kiva's nose, and she whirled again, her back pressed to the door as she stared at the 3 metal grates, the sound of clicking and grinding meeting her ears. "No, no, no," Kiva whispered, leaning as far into the stone door as she could, as if the further she could get from the grates, the safer she was. It was a lie. There was nowhere in this room that was safe, the charring on the door beside her face telling her as much. Slow breaths, Nori had told her, and stay low. The slow breaths were impossible right now, since Kiva was gasping for air. She made herself follow the second order, sliding down the door until she was crouched on the ground, her hand reaching for the amulet and pulling it from beneath her tunic, a grip so tight that the edges of the crest dug into her palm. It was ironic, really, that the golden edges of the that the golden crown was piercing her skin, damaging her before the fire even started. But then she saw the deep orange glow at the edges of the 3 sealed grates, a hint of heat touching her exposed flesh as the smell of smoke grew stronger. Maybe the furnace would break. Maybe Grendel would find a way to make it look like it was working without it incinerating Kiva in the process. Maybe the grates opened, the metal unsealing and sliding upward at the click of a gear. And then came the inferno. Chapter 22. Kiva screamed. She didn't mean to. The sound just wrenched from her throat, her hands dropping the amulet to cover her face as the tempest of flames surged into the room, filling every space from the ground right up to the arched ceilings. Seconds, that was all it took for her to be surrounded. The firestorm was all she could see, all she could hear, the roaring and crackling overwhelming her ears and as blistering heat slammed into her like a wave. She expected to feel the instant agony of fire searing her flesh, her screams turning to terror, from terror to pain, her life flashing before her eyes as she swiftly burned to death. None of that happened. Slowly, Kiva lowered her hands, gaping at what she found. The flames were touching every part of her, and yet they also weren't. The amulet she wore was glowing, a bright light pulsating outward from it, covering her like a barrier from head to toe. She stretched out her shaking fingers, watching in awe as the inferno swirled around the room, fully encompassing her, and yet caused no harm. A manic laugh left Kiva, which quickly turned into a sob, before she could capture the sound and thrust it deep down within her to keep more from coming. If she ever saw Mirren again, she would throw aside all her enmity and shower the princess with gratitude. If not for her elemental magic, Kiva would be writhing on the stone floor right now, rather than crouching and watching the fire as it raged around her. Seconds turned into minutes as Kiva stayed low to the ground. She didn't dare move, lest she risk disturbing the magic in the amulet. Had she been braver, she might have risen and walked round the room, like some fire goddess dancing in the flames. But all she did was remain pressed against the door, willing back her tears as she waited for 10 minutes to come to an end. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Kiva counted down in her head, seeking any distraction from the growing heat, from the smoke that was beginning to smother her, no matter how low she crouched to seek fresher air. 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Sweat dripped off her, soaking her clothes, mixing with her tears that finally began to fall as shock took hold. It didn't matter that she was still alive, the amulet keeping her safe from the flames. Her terror was too strong, too powerful to remain buried within her. No one could see her tears in here. The heat was almost enough to evaporate them before they could trickle off her chin. 6 minutes. Something was wrong. Kiva knew it as she started coughing, as the heat that had been slowly rising turned from uncomfortable to nearly unbearable. Looking down, she could see the amulet still pulsing with light, but it was flickering as if running out of power. No, Kiva willed it, holding it tightly, careful not to speak aloud, and risk breathing in extra smoke. Just a little longer. 7 minutes. Kiva's sleeve caught on fire. She yelped and jumped up, flames billowing into her face, and inhaled a lungful of smoke that sent her into a coughing fit. She threw herself on the ground, rolling around on the stone to stifle the fire that was now latching onto the rest of her clothes. But it was no use. No, 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 Kiva screamed mentally, her throat burning as she struggled to breathe, sucking in nothing but hot air and fumes. 8 minutes. Kiva's tunic was incinerating, her pants burning to ash, the amulet now straining to protect just her skin. The scent of caranut tickled her nostrils amid all the all-consuming smoke. Mott's waxy mixture finally having to fight alongside the princess's magic. She was so close to the end, so close to surviving the ordeal, but the power in the amulet was fading, and Kiva didn't know how long it would last. Already she could feel her throat swelling, blistering on the inside. The elemental magic might have been protecting her flesh, but the room was now filled with toxic smoke. With very little oxygen remaining, Kiva didn't know how much more her body could handle without a fresh supply of air. Would suffocation take her life, even if fire itself failed? Would her organs begin to shut down, one after the other? Or would shock send her into cardiac arrest? Her heart had been leaping out of her chest since before she'd been sealed in this room. It surely couldn't last much longer. 9 minutes. Kiva moaned as sweat slicked over her body and then evaporated in seconds. She could feel Mott's waxy remedy dissolving from her skin, the protection it afforded melting right off her. Gasping and wheezing, she had no fight left in her to do anything but curl up in the fetal position against the stone door, wrapping her arms around her knees and closing her eyes. This was it. She couldn't last any longer. She couldn't survive until the end. She couldn't. The roaring stopped. The heat began to fade. The door opened and Kiva fell back, still curled around herself. She couldn't open her eyes, couldn't move, every part of her aching. But air, fresh, pure air called to her, and she sucked in a breath before coughing, coughing, coughing. She felt as if she were dying, her lungs burning, her throat screaming. "You're all right, you're alive, just breathe," came Nari's voice, as if from far away. "Nah, don't try to speak," the guard said, and Kiva felt cloth being draped over her, the familiar scent of leather and oranges that she'd come to recognize as belonging to Nari, now surrounding her, covering her nakedness. "What's this?" came another voice. Warden Rook. Kiva felt a weight lifted from around her neck. She tried to protest, tried to open her eyes and reclaim the amulet, but she was still coughing too violently. "Unbelievable," growled Rook. "I told those sodding royals not to interfere." He spat a curse. Typical. I should have expected it from the Valentus brats. "You asked them not to attend today's trial," Nari said to the warden. Nothing else. Nothing else my backside. If it had been anyone else. Rook released a disgruntled sound, then sighed and said, "What's done is done. Get her up. She needs to walk out of here on her own 2 feet. She's in no condition to get her up," Rook repeated, his tone broking no argument. Gentle hands reached for Kiva, the cloth, Nari's short cloak, being carefully rearranged over her shoulders and dropping until it covered her torso, stopping at her upper thighs. It didn't hide enough of her flesh for comfort, nor did the smears of black charcoal that coated her skin. Normally Kiva would have been appalled at parading in front of the assembled masses outside the crematorium wearing so little, but right now she didn't care if she had to crawl naked through them, as long as it meant getting back to the safety of the infirmary and dosing herself with something to ease her breathing. "Up we go," Nari said, drawing Kiva's arm around her shoulders and bearing most of her weight. "I've got you." Kiva wanted to thank the guard, but the idea of forming words right now was beyond her. A quick, exhausted glance around the hallway revealed Rook's scowling face, Grendel's comical shock, and Bones, who was staring at Kiva's bare legs. The expression he wore made her want to head straight to the shower block, but then she swallowed, and the blisters all the way down her trachea screamed their objection. Medicine first, then she would clean and cover herself. "Let's get this done," Rook muttered, leading the way along the hallway, then into the antechamber at the entrance of the crematorium. Once there, he waited for Kiva and Nari to catch up, their progress being much slower, since while Kiva's flesh wasn't burnt, she was still suffering the effects of heat stroke and smoke inhalation. Along with her damaged throat, her eyes were burning, her head was pounding, her muscles were cramping, and her heart rate was still too fast. The more steps she took, the less confident she was that she'd be able to make it back to the infirmary on her own, even with Nari helping her. All she wanted to do was stop and rest for just a few minutes. "Open your eyes," Nari hissed, giving Kiva a small shake that caused bolts to prickle along her nerve endings, bringing her back into consciousness, just as it had started to fade. "Stay with me long enough for Rook to make his announcement. Then you can pass out." Kiva was having trouble understanding, her eyelids fluttering again, despite Nari's orders, her breathing coming in panting rasps, but she forced herself to stay awake, to remain upright, as Nari helped her shuffle out of the crematorium after Rook into the bright winter sunshine. Icy wind touched her face, her legs exposed every part of her. Kiva moaned, basking in the cool relief. She was tempted to throw the cloak off, but sanity prevailed, and she used her free hand to keep it clasped at the front, attempting to maintain some semblance of modesty. "Tilda Quarantine's champion has successfully completed the trial by fire," Warden Rook announced in a loud voice to the awaiting prisoners. Shock murmured across the audience before cries and applause rang out, tentative at first, and then loud enough to make Kiva's ears hurt on top of everything else. She didn't have it into her to investigate who was genuinely pleased by her surviving, as opposed to those who wished she'd failed. Rook raised his hand, and when the crowd quieted again, he said, "In 2 weeks, Kiva Meriden will face her third task, the trial by water. You will bear witness, as is law. Until then, you're dismissed back to your regular duties." The crowd began to disperse, while Kiva swayed in Nari's arms. "Are we done here?" the guard asked Rook. "Go," the warden replied, with a flick of his hand. But when Nari started to lead Kiva away, Rook said, "No, wait." He held up the amulet between them. Kiva's eyes were moving in and out of focus as she blinked against the dry grittiness left over from the fire, trying her hardest to keep from yielding to the darkness creeping into her vision. "This can't happen again," Rook warned Kiva in a low voice. "I told you I can't help you, and I assumed it was implied that no one else can help you either. I don't care that Prince Deverick is the heir to Avalon's throne. If anyone interferes with your third task, royal or otherwise, there will be consequences. Do you understand?" Kiva shook her head, but not because she didn't understand. "It wasn't the prince," she rasped out, sounding like charcoal scraping against wood. Rook's expression tightened. Don't lie to me. He thrust the amulet at Kiva, and she fumbled for it with her hand that was still clasping the cloak. Nari took it from her, sliding it into her own pocket for safekeeping. I'm not, Kiva said, all but wheezing now. It wasn't the prince, it was the princess. Everyone knows Princess Mirren doesn't have enough fire magic for the stunt you pulled today, Rook said. It's public record. She can manage a few small flames at best, but her real talent is with air, the power in your little amulet. You can thank Prince Deverick for that. He's the strongest fire elemental in the Valentis family. Kiva tried to think back to when Mirren had given her the amulet. She'd implied that she'd filled the ruby with her own magic. But now Kiva realized she'd never actually said it outright. Was it really the Crown Prince who had intervened? Again? Mirren had alluded to Deverick's superficial thoughts toward Kiva, and he himself had flirted with her in the infirmary. But was that truly enough for him to have saved her? Twice? If so, why did Mirren make Kiva believe the amulet was from her? The last Kiva figured was because the Valentis siblings weren't supposed to be helping her. Tilda Quarantine was their enemy, and ignoring her mystery illness, Kiva was all that stood between the rebel queen and death. The crown prince would likely find himself in a great deal of trouble with his court should anyone realize what he had done. But why had he done it? Was it truly because he was attracted to her? My brother is a reckless, impulsive fool, yet he still manages to be one of the best people I know. Recalling what Mirren had said about Deverick, Kiva wondered if maybe, just maybe, the Crown Prince understood justice better than the rest of his family. Maybe he thought Tilda was worth giving a fighting chance. Maybe he thought she was worth saving. And Kiva too. Uncertain, Kiva realized that now wasn't the time to puzzle over it. Now, not when she was barely holding on to consciousness. It won't happen again, Kiva told Rook, meaning it. She had no further tricks up her sleeve, no more amulets or anything else that could help in her next elemental task. And the royal siblings were long gone. She would get no assistance or answers from them. See that it doesn't, the warden said gruffly. Then his tone softened, and he moved closer until they were eye to eye. I'm glad you're still alive. Kiva struggled to keep up with the turn in conversation, every part of her aching. I mean it, Rook went on. I have to adhere to the law when it comes to these ordeals, but I'm relieved that you survived. Kiva swallowed back the emotion welling within her, pain lacerating down her throat as she did so. Maybe Rook did care in his own way. After all, with this sickness going around, Rook trailed off, shaking his head as if fearing what her death would mean for all of them. Kiva's heart plummeted at the reminder that he didn't care about her, only what she could do for him. She was a fool for thinking he would ever be concerned for her welfare. Rook was too pragmatic for that, too calculated to think about anyone but himself. I hear you started to make progress, he asked. Yes, Kiva croaked, unable to offer more. It was a lie, but she had no energy to debrief him right now. Something like this went around years ago, soon after I first became the warden, Rook said, a nostalgic gleam in his dark eyes. You were probably too young to remember. I remember. Rook held her gaze, and then his expression cleared, as if suddenly recalling why she would remember, and who she had lost to the sickness. He nodded once and said, Best of luck to you then. By the sounds of it, many lives are counting on you. Including yours, Kiva wanted to say, but didn't, partly to keep provoking him, and partly to avoid the pain the words would bring. See her back to the infirmary, guard Arel, Rook said to Nari, who dipped her forehead in agreement. The warden then turned and strode away, the 3 guards and Bones following in his wake. Kiva, I'm so sorry, Grendel said in her quiet, grating voice once the guards were gone. He didn't tell me what the furnace was for until this morning, and by then I didn't have time to warn you if I'd known. It's not your fault, Kiva rasped. She wanted to reach for the scarred woman, but with one arm around Nari, the other clutching her cloak, all she could do was try and smile at the crematorium worker, even if it was more likely looked like a grimace. "How did you survive?" Grendel whispered. The lowered tone wasn't to keep from being overheard, since the prisoners around them were making an awful racket as they fled in disorganized groups out of the assembly area. No, her hushed voice was because she was still shocked that Kiva was alive when what she'd faced should have killed her. "It's a long story," Kiva forced out, wincing at how much harder it was becoming to speak. "I'll tell you another time." It was an empty promise, since Kiva wasn't sure she'd even remember this interaction after she drugged herself into oblivion. As if sensing that she was on borrowed time, Nari told Grendel that she needed to get Kiva to the infirmary, and then the guard began to help Kiva stumble in that direction. Fortunately, only the morgue was between them and their destination, and Kiva felt confident that she'd be able to make it. But then her legs gave out. Nari grunted under the added weight, and the 3 male voices cried out Kiva's name in alarm. Tip, Mott, and Jaren. It was the last who reached her first, and before Kiva knew what was happening, he swept her up into his arms, taking her from Nari and striding quickly toward the infirmary. Kiva wanted to protest, but she didn't have enough strength to be embarrassed, let alone ask that he release her. Even if he had, she wouldn't have been able to manage another step on her own, not without help. "Sorry," she whispered, rasped into his neck, holding on tight. "Don't talk," he told her. "We're nearly there." "What happened in the trial?" Tip asked, jogging to keep up with Jaren's long strides. "We saw smoke come out of it." "Hush, child," Mott interrupted him. "Let Kiva rest a while. Why don't you come help me for the afternoon, and you can check in on her later tonight?" "But—" "It's all right, Tip," Jaren said. "I'll take care of her." Kiva's eyes were closing of their own accord, but she still heard Tip say, "Promise?" "I promise." Kiva wasn't sure what happened next, and she began to float in and out of consciousness. She was aware of Tip and Mott leaving once they reached the morgue, after which she heard Nari and Jaren whispering to each other as they continued on to the infirmary. She only caught snatches of their conversation, but from what she could follow in her semi-lucid state, Nari was talking about the amulet she'd taken from Kiva, likely filling Jaren in on how it had been imbued with the prince's fire magic, and that it had saved her life. The next thing Kiva knew, she was in the infirmary, lying on the bed. She'd awoken in after the last ordeal, but instead of Mirren being by her side, this time it was Jaren. "How long was I out?" she croaked, her voice still sounding terrible. "Only a few minutes. We just got here," Jaren said, pointing to Nari, who was standing by the workbench and frowning down at the organized chaos. "We're not sure what you need. Poppy milk?" Kiva nodded, then shook her head before weakly pushing aside the blanket that had been draped over her bare legs. No, stay in bed," Jaren said, holding her hand. You tell us and we'll get it for you." Kiva willed her brain to focus and rasped out a few names, being careful to mention specific dosages. Too much of the wrong combination, and she'd end up feeling worse than she already did. After downing copious amounts of tallow fruit nectar for her lungs and throat, crown nettle for her headache and dizziness, yellow nut for an energy boost, and a small dose of poppy milk for the rest of her lingering aches and pains, Kiva proceeded to swallow nearly an entire pail of fresh, cool water, before finally lying back in her bed, ready to sleep for the next 13 years. "Anything else?" Jaren asked. "I wouldn't say no to some aloe gel," Kiva murmured, relieved that her voice didn't sound or feel as painful. It was still hoarse, but nowhere near what it had been before the swift-acting tallow fruit nectar. She heard Jaren leave her bedside. Then the tinkering of objects began moving on the workbench, before his footsteps returned to her again. Her eyes were still closed until she felt him take her arm in his hands, followed by the cool, soothing sensation of the aloeweed being rubbed gently into her flesh. Kiva's eyes shot open and she sat up. "I can do it. Lie down, Kiva," Jaren ordered in a no-nonsense voice. "But just close your eyes and rest," he said firmly. Kiva bit her lip, but the feeling of the gel on her skin was too good for her to object. She hadn't suffered any burns, but she still felt the after-effects of so much heat, as if the fire had burrowed deep into her bones and was trying to find a way out. The aloeweed soothed that feeling, and combined with Jaren's long tender strokes, Kiva soon found herself relaxing, almost entirely against her will. He focused on ministrations on her hands and arms, careful not to let his fingers wander anywhere else, and she in turn was careful not to mention any other places that could use attention. Once he left, she could see to the rest of her body, especially since, as the other medicines began to kick in, she remembered that she was only wearing Nari's short cloak and a light blanket. While all her important parts were covered, she was still much more vulnerable than she'd ever been around Jaren before, other than perhaps last night, but even then, they'd both been fully clothed. "Better?" he asked, finishing with her other arm and sitting back down beside her. "Much," she told him, again grateful not to be rasping. "Thank you." She glanced around for Nari, wanting to thank her too for all her help, but the guard must have snuck away while Kiva was downing all her remedies. "I have a question for you," Jaren said, somewhat hesitantly. Kiva looked back at him, noting his fiddling hands. He was nervous, although she couldn't imagine why. She assumed he wanted to ask her about the ordeal, even if Nari had already filled him in on the amulet, which the guard hadn't returned to Kiva, and Kiva doubted she would ever see again. The crest had done what she'd needed. She had no further use for it. A lot had happened in the crematorium, most of which Nari didn't know, since Kiva had been alone in the furnace. She shuddered and blocked out the memory, not yet ready to talk about it, even with Jaren. She could just about tell him as much, but he continued speaking before she could. "I don't want you to think I was perving on you earlier," Jaren began, but then he stopped. Kiva's eyebrows shot upwards since she hadn't been expecting that opener. Her body tightened slightly with surprise, but then she relaxed again, remembering who she was with and how cautious he seemed. Plus, from the sound of it, he wasn't going to ask about the trial, and she was eager for any kind of distraction. Seeking to assure him, since she felt confident that whatever he was about to say, he hadn't been perving on her, Kiva joked. "If you don't finish, I'm going to assume that's exactly what you were doing." Her attempt at humor didn't ease him at all. "It's just..." He shifted uncomfortably, like he didn't know what to say, or perhaps how to say it. "What, Jaren?" He rubbed his neck and avoided her eyes, finally blowing out a breath and saying, "Never mind. Forget I said anything." "Just tell me," Kiva pressed, both curious and concerned now. For a long moment Jaren remained silent, as if debating with himself, but then he paused. But then he inhaled deeply and met her gaze. "Your scars on your thighs," he paused. "I saw them when I was carrying you here. They look a lot like..." He trailed off again, but this time Kiva didn't prompt him further. Her insides had frozen at his words, her mind locking and unable to form a coherent thought. "It's nothing, they're nothing," she said, waving a hand dismissively, but her voice was too high, her attempted indifference too obvious. Jaren's blue-gold eyes were steady on hers, and this time it was she who looked away, as if fearing he'd drag the answer right up out of her soul. She cleared her throat, winced at the residual pain, and wished she'd asked for a stronger dose of poppy milk. if only so that it could have knocked her out and kept her from this conversation. It didn't look like nothing, Jaren said, his voice quiet, coaxing but not demanding. From the careful way he was holding himself and waiting patiently for her response, Kiva knew that if she repeated her answer, he'd let it go and likely never ask again. She opened her mouth to do just that, to keep her secret, but when she tried to lie to him a second time, the words wouldn't come. She wasn't sure if it was just the heady combination of all the remedies now swirling within her, but when she made herself meet Jaren's eyes again, she wanted to tell him the truth. She'd seen the scars on his back, learned of the abuse he'd sustained in receiving them, his own hidden tapestry, and the story behind it. Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad to share her story too. Kiva moved her eyes to the ceiling, unable to look at him while offering such a raw glimpse of her past. I was 12 years old the first time I had to carve Zalandorf's symbol into someone's flesh, she said, barely audible, as if deciding whether she wanted to be heard or not. The Heartless Carver, you've heard their name for me. But despite what they think, despite how they see me act, I feel every single one of those marks on every single person I carve. And I have for 5 years. Jaren shifted toward her, but Kiva didn't return her gaze to him. I don't do it anymore, she whispered, one hand unconsciously moving to the blanket over her thigh. But in the early days, I felt too much and I had no one to talk to about it. Every time I carved someone, I needed an emotional release afterward. I needed to atone, she said. So for every person I carved, I cut myself too. Later, of course, when no one was around, no one ever knew. She drew in a deep breath and mustered the courage to pull aside the blanket just enough to reveal the scars on both thighs, the rest of her still covered by Nari's cloak. She trailed a finger across the pink lines, smudged now with charcoal, their severity having faded over the years she'd stopped self-harming. Looking back, I'm not sure if I was punishing myself for hurting others, or if I thought that by sharing in their pain I was standing with them, even if they didn't know, and would never know, she swallowed. But when it became an addiction, I knew I had to stop. I recognized the signs once I started craving the pain, the rush of endorphins that broke through the all-consuming numbness I felt, and I knew it wasn't healthy. Knew I wouldn't be able to help anyone else if I didn't help myself first. She swallowed again. It wasn't easy to stop, but I took it one day at a time, one new carving at a time, and eventually the numbness faded, along with the need to hurt myself. She ran her fingers over her scars again and admitted, I still feel the guilt, every single time, but I also know that the blame isn't on me, and I think that's what helps the most. That's what keeps me from falling back into old habits. She paused, staring at the pink faded lines before finishing. Well, that and focusing on healing everyone who comes to me. I never want to risk not being there for them, for any reason, especially one that's self-inflicted. Kiva had run out of words. She was surprised by just how much she had revealed to Jaren, how she bared her wounds to him, quite literally. She still couldn't look at him, afraid of what she might see on his face, unsure whether it would be pity or understanding or disgust, or a combination of all three. But then he was moving, standing from his seat beside her bed, and she couldn't help her gaze from flicking to him as he leaned toward her closer and closer, until his lips brushed her forehead in a whisper-soft kiss. Thank you for trusting me, Kiva, he told her quietly, as he pulled away enough to look into her eyes. Thank you for sharing. His face didn't show pity, understanding, or disgust. His expression unlike anything Kiva had ever seen from him before. Warmth pooled in her core, and a host of butterflies took flight in her stomach. They stared at one another, barely a breath apart. Kiva didn't know what to say, wasn't even sure if she'd be able to respond. Fear she'd utter the wrong thing, but she didn't need to speak at all, because Jaren broke their contact to reach for a blanket, pulling it back over her and tucking it in at the sides until she was wrapped up like a cocoon. But then he took her hand and threaded his fingers with hers before laying them on her blanketed leg, right over her scars, as he said, "You need to rest." He squeezed her hand and promised, "I'll keep an eye on Tilda and the quarantine patients until Tip gets here. You just let the medicine work and sleep off everything that happened today, all right?" His tender actions and generosity caused Kiva's still sore throat to tighten, keeping her from replying verbally, but she nodded and summoned the boldness to squeeze his fingers in return. Jaren smiled at her, his entire face filling with open affection, and that was the image she held on to as she closed her eyes and finally allowed her body to relax after the trauma of her day. She feared the ordeal would replay across her mind, keeping her awake, reminding her of the fiery tempest that she'd barely survived. But no, Jaren's smile didn't leave her, nor did Jaren himself, since she was aware of him moving quietly around the infirmary, checking on Tilda, and then entering the quarantine room, just as he'd promised. Unable to keep in her own smile, Kiva snuggled deeper into her cocoon. Seconds later, she was asleep. Okay, trial by ordeal number 2, done. We're up to chapter 23, and we're up to page 249. So we're 60% of the way through. And we've got 61 billion cookies. Whew. Let's... some of those. And some more of those. And we're back to 6. We've got some more achievements unlocked. And at least 7 grandma tarts. And now you're thinking, have 50 portals. 120. A lucky cookie. Got a lucky cookie, and we got 7 million. Quick 7 golden cookies. Nice. 130. Alright. Let's move on with another 2 chapters. Chapter 23. Kiva spent the rest of Saturday and the entirety of Sunday in bed, following orders from Mott, Tip, Jaren, and Nari. By the time Monday rolled around, she was going stir-crazy. Her desperation to continue researching the stomach sickness, the illness her father had died from, had her up at the crack of dawn, waiting anxiously for her escort's arrival. Nari took her sweet time, and when she finally appeared at the entrance to the infirmary, Kiva shot out the door. Come on, we have so much to do," she said as she began walking briskly toward the front gates. Nari chuckled. Someone's been cooped up far too long. It was unnecessary, Kiva said, sidestepping to avoid a puddle on the gravel. I was perfectly fine yesterday. The guard's reply was dry. Yes, you were the picture of health when you got out of bed and fell flat on your face. I was fine after that. Admit it, you just wanted Jaren's arms around you again. Kiva's head whipped around so fast that she stumbled on the path. Sending a glare to the grinning Nari, she said, "That's not what happened." "I was there," the guard said, her grin widening. "He was very quick to catch you." and very slow to release you. Kiva grated her teeth together. I think we should go back to walking in silence. Nari laughed, genuine amusement flooding her features. Too late, healer. You're not afraid of me anymore. That ship has sailed. I was never afraid of you, Kiva laughed. Nari snorted her disbelief. You're a god, Kiva conceded, throwing her hands out to the sides. You're meant to incite some level of intimidation. That's the whole point of your job. Guess I just wasn't born to work in a place like Zalandov, Nari mused. The words prompted an icy feeling to spread throughout Kiva. Nari had already been at the prison much longer than most of the other female guards over the years. And while Kiva had acknowledged that her limb difference would make it harder for her to get a protective role elsewhere, that didn't mean it was impossible. But the idea of her leaving, at least you wouldn't have to worry about catching your death somewhere else, Kiva made herself say, ignoring the dread filling her. I'm surprised you didn't ride the first wagon out of here once we realized the sickness was spreading. Nari made a pensive sound, but then said, I've never been one to leave when things get tough. She lifted her prosthetic hand and wiggled her fingers at Kiva. What kind of person would that make me? Kiva didn't respond, though she did feel as if a weight had lifted off her chest. At the same time, she was alarmed, since the fact that she feared Nari leaving meant she'd grown closer to the god than was wise. But she also had no idea how to reverse that, how to put a stopper in the friendship that had somehow formed between them. Worse, she didn't know if she wanted to. And therein lay the real danger. It wasn't that surprising that, in her desperation to believe her family was coming for her, she'd latched onto another source of comfort, of familiarity. Her family and the rebels had let her down by not arriving before the second trial. That didn't mean they weren't still out there, strategizing another plan to free both Kiva and Tilda, but Kiva couldn't ignore the resentment brewing within her, the sense of abandonment that had been creeping in for 10 years. She still loved her family, of course, she did, but she couldn't deny how disappointed she felt, and had felt for a decade. Her growing relationship with Nari had helped to cover that, to stifle it deep down, and her growing relationship with Jaren too. What's on today's agenda? Nari asked as they passed the barracks and continued along the path. Grateful for the distraction, Kiva answered. All the farm animals, including dairy as well as vegetables and grains. She ticked off her fingers and spoke. And the slaughterhouse. Nari whistled through her teeth. That's a lot. We need to catch up since you all decided to become overprotective nursemaids on me yesterday, Kiva said pointedly. She knew they'd meant well, but people were dying, just as they had 9 years ago, just as her father had. She refused to see anyone else she cared about fall victims of the illness. If I get enough samples today, I'll spend tomorrow testing the rats. I think that's the best way to do it. A day of collecting, followed by a day of testing? Kiva nodded. That way, I'll lessen the risk of missing any symptoms or confusing any of the test subjects. I'll narrow the options down, place by place, until we find the origin. We may get lucky and today will be all you need, if it comes from the farms. That's the hope, Kiva said. The sooner we figure out where it began, the sooner I can look into stopping it. How? Heaving her bag of collection flasks higher up over the shoulder, Kiva wondered what her father might have done, but came up empty. I'm not sure yet. Once I know the origin, that'll hopefully give me an indication of what's needed to treat it. What if it doesn't? What if you can't figure it out? Kiva made herself adopt a light tone and shrugged and said, Then we all die, I guess. Nari arched an eyebrow, and Kiva caught the expression from her peripheral vision as they walked side by side toward the entrance block. Remind me never to come to you for encouragement, Nari muttered under her breath. Kiva hid her smile, but then said, Almost every sickness can be treated. Whether it can be cured is something else entirely, but given the symptoms I've seen, I'm confident one can be found for this. Whatever it is, I just need more information. And her father had just needed some more time. Sorry, I've lost my place on the book. In the book. Not on the book, in the book. And her father had just needed more time. She was sure of it. Farron Meriden was the best healer Kiva had ever known. He would have figured out how to cure the sickness eventually. Perhaps he did, and that was why it ended up vanishing soon after his own death. But he'd left no research, no instructions, so now it was up to Kiva to figure it out. "What about your next trial?" Nari asked as they approached the gates. "Have you started thinking about it yet?" It was hard for Kiva not to think about it. She'd barely survived the trial by fire, and that was with magical help. She had no idea what the water ordeal would require of her, no idea how she might endure it. "I have 12 days to worry about that," Kiva answered. "My priority right now is making sure we all survive. Making sure we're all still alive then." Nari sent Kiva a sidelong glance before waving to the guards up on the watchtower. Let's get you what you need," she said. "After you, healer." And so, for the second time in the week, Kiva stepped outside the prison, praying she'd find what she was in searching for. The rest of Kiva's week was spent following the pattern that began to repeat itself, to her unending frustration. After the farms and the slaughterhouse, she spent the next day as she told Nari she would, testing the rats, and watching for any signs of change. When no symptoms presented themselves, Kiva asked Tip to round up extra vermin, and the following day she and Nari ventured out of the Blackwood Forest, a trek that took them even longer than their journey to the quarry. Once there, Kiva collected samples from the lumber yard and even the forest itself, along with the rail carts that transported the timber back through the prison gates and out of Valendorf to Vaskin and beyond. From wood trippings to tree fungi, flower pollen to fluffy moss, plus the usual stagnant water puddles and mud, Kiva collected anything that might create an ideal viral or bacterial environment. But when she spent the next day testing the rats, they again showed no sign of illness. Having completed her collection outside of Valendorf's walls, Kiva's attention switched to inside the prison. On Friday, nearly a week after her fire ordeal, Kiva headed to the Aluminum Depository, a large rectangular building in the south of the grounds. Just inside the gates, she didn't need Nari escorting her anymore since she was within the grounds, but the guards still accompanied her to the storage facility and the adjacent processing factory. Kiva wasn't sure if Nari was curious about the research or she simply wanted to keep spending time with her. Once or twice, Kiva had inwardly questioned the guards' motives, even going so far as to wonder if she somehow aligned with the rebels, watching over Kiva for the sake of Tilda. Another possibility Kiva entertained was whether Rook had assigned Nari to protect her or to spy on her, but neither option sat right with Kiva, and with little evidence for either, she decided she was better off not worrying about whether Nari was going to stab her in the back, metaphorically speaking, perhaps literally speaking too. There was, however, one burning question Kiva still had about the guard, and that was regarding her relationship with Jaren. Even though Nari had firmly stated she would never cross that line, Kiva still had doubts. Especially when she discovered that Nari was tasked with monitoring the tunnelers anytime she wasn't guarding the infirmary, and therefore she saw Jaren a lot more than either of them had let on. Try as she might, Kiva remained suspicious of the easy, relaxed way in which they interacted. While she wasn't one to objectify the human body, Kiva had seen Jaren without his tunic on. She'd felt his arms around her, his lips touching her forehead, his hands entwined with hers. Heck, she'd slept wrapped in him, his warmth and strength surrounding her all night, keeping her safe, protected in her own Jaren cocoon. The memories brought warmth to Kiva's cheek, and she scolded herself for being so ridiculous. If Nori had lied about being intimate with Jaren, then that was between the two of them. Kiva didn't care. She didn't. She did, however, become very good at lying to herself. The samples from the aluminum depository were cleared after testing the rats the next day, and Kiva's concern grew as the list of places left to check continued to shrink. "Don't worry about it, love," Mott told her on Saturday night when he and his morgue workers came to collect another load of the dead. "You'll figure it out. You always do, just like your dad." Mott had never mentioned Kiva's father, and he would have heard... Mott had never met Kiva's father, but he would have heard all about Farron Meriden from some of the older prisoners, much of which was supposition, Kiva assumed. But still, tears crept to her eyes at his words, because he was right about one thing: her father would have never given up, and he'd solved the problem, even if it killed him, which in this case it had. But Mott wasn't wrong. Kiva was just like her father, and she wouldn't give up either. "Forget about that sick for now," Mott went on. "What about your next ordeal? Any ideas what you'll face? Do you have a plan?" Kiva had been thinking about it all week. After much consideration, she'd come to the conclusion that the third trial would likely involve Zalandov's aquifer, the huge underground reservoir that the tunnelers fed water into. Nothing else could offer the same kind of drama as the first two ordeals, or the same kind of danger. Most prisoners couldn't swim, so Kiva would be expected to drown. However, no one knew where she had grown up, with the swift, deep Aldon River running adjacent to her family's cottage just outside Riverfell, nor did they know how many hours she and her siblings had spent honing their swimming skills. Granted, it had been a long time since Kiva had used hers, but her confidence was enough that she felt marginally less worried about the coming trial than any of the others. That didn't mean she wasn't still terrified. In the first two ordeals, she'd had the support of the Valentus Royals, the prince's elemental power saving her life twice. Kiva still couldn't reconcile how she felt about that, how she felt about them, since their family was the reason she'd lost 10 years of her life to Zalandov, the reason she'd been torn from her mother and her older siblings, the reason her father and brother were dead. And yet Kiva would have perished by now if not for Prince Deverett saving her life. Twice. No matter how much she wanted to hate them, all of them, Kiva couldn't. But she also couldn't forgive them, not for all the elemental magic in the world. She did, however, wish for some of that elemental magic to help with her final two trials, especially since she'd given up believing that the rebels would make a second strike at the prison. Cresta was all but vibrating with fury anytime Kiva saw her, which was confirmation enough that their plans had fallen apart, that they would need time before trying again. Time that Kiva didn't have. It had been a fool's hope from the beginning, and yet it had helped her get through the first two ordeals. But now, without the rebels and without the royals, her hope was in herself. Whether or not she survived the trial by water was wholly dependent on her own skills, her own strength, her own will to succeed. To Mott, however, all Kiva answered was, "I'm working on it." The old man sent her a weathered, piercing look. "I've been speaking with Grendel. We think it'll be down in the aquifer," Kiva said, nodding with agreement. "That's all I can come up with, too. They could, of course, toss you down a well," he said, scratching his stubbly chin. "But no one would really see you drown. They just have to pull your corpse up after, all waterlogged and bloated. That's boring. Same for anything in the shower block. We can't all fit in there to watch, can we? But the tunnels have plenty of room for an audience, even if we won't all be able to see much. To himself, he murmured, "Better get down there fast for the best view." Kiva knew he was trying to help, but still her stomach roiled, especially when she noted the hint of excitement on his face, as if he was looking forward to seeing what would happen. When he caught her pale expression, his own shifted, remorse and shame tinging his features. "Don't you fret, Kiva, love," Mott said. "I'll have me a think on what might help ya. Plenty of remedies for endurance. But I'll have to get creative with lung expansion and oxygen absorption and the like. You leave it with old Mott. I'll sort you out." The smile Kiva sent to him was wobbly. "Thank you," the old man replied with his own brown-toothed grin. "You're a survivor, Kiva Meriden. You'll survive this too." And with that encouragement, he hobbled out of the infirmary, trailing behind a cartload of corpses. The following day, Kiva and Nari set out to collect samples involving food storage and preparation, from the butchery with its bleeding, smoking, drying, and salting rooms, to the grain silos and their sorting factory, to the large underground cellars where the fruits and vegetables were preserved alongside the milk and cheese. Kiva had her work cut out for her. Not only did she have to obtain samples of the food themselves, but she also had to swab the hand tools that the workers used to do everything from pickling radishes to churning butter to baking bread. The rations allocated to prisoners might have been low, but the guards received 3-course meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so the preparation rooms were bustling with activity as Kiva and Nari attempted to complete their task. After moving from the busy kitchens to the empty refectory, they finally returned to the infirmary, where Tip was waiting, playing with yet more rats. Kiva had no idea how he continued to procure them, and was inwardly horrified by how vast the nest near the crematorium must be. She was secretly relieved that there was no need to collect samples from the furnaces, since no one who went in there came back out again. No one but her. Shaking off the thought, Kiva fed the newest samples to the rats, but after testing them the next day, none revealed any symptoms, and her hopes began to crumble. "Tomorrow's the day," Tip said when he saw how crestfallen she was that night. "I can feel it. Something big is going to happen. Just you wait." Bolstered by his confidence, Kiva set out with Nari again, and the next morning, Bolstered by his confidence, Kiva set out with Nari again the next morning, this time to test most of the remaining buildings inside the grounds, including the entrance block, the general workrooms, and administration, the guards, barracks, and dog kennels, and lastly the 10-cell blocks where the prisoners slept, along with their adjoining latrines and bathing facilities. After this, all she had left to test were the aquifer, pumping station, and tunnels, which she planned to do in the 4 days remaining before her next ordeal. Should the rats continue to remain healthy more than ever, she was aware that she was running out of time and options. When Kiva returned with Nari to the infirmary that evening, her bag of samples in hand, she expected to see Tip waiting with more vermin. They didn't actually need any more, since the young boy had been so proficient in catching them. But still, it was strange that he wasn't in the infirmary, since he'd been dutifully watching over Tilda and the quarantine patients on the days Kiva went out to collect her samples. Early on, he'd wanted to join her, especially when she no longer had to leave through the gates. But with Alicia and Nurgle providing only minimal care to the sick, Tip had volunteered to watch over them, something that had filled Kiva with immeasurable pride. "Have you seen Tip?" Kiva asked Nurgle as she dropped her bag on the workbench, waving to Nari when the guard gestured that she was taking off, likely heading to the tunnels, and to Jaren. She reminded herself that she didn't care what they got up to when they were alone. She didn't care. Haven't seen him, Nurgle said, sitting on a stool near the workbench and finger-combing his long blonde hair before tying it at his nape with a leather band. Is he in with the quarantine patients? Kiva asked, aware of Nurgle's short attention span and that he often needed prompting. Not sure, the willowy man said, as he stood up and stretched as if he'd just completed a hard day's labour. Kiva doubted he'd moved from that position in hours. Maybe. Alicia, Kiva asked, the pockmarked woman who was hastily wiping her mouth after having helped herself to Tilda's rations, as if Kiva didn't know about her repeated stealing of the sick woman's food and that of all the other ill patients. Not since this morning, Alicia answered, one brown eye looking at Kiva, the other drifting lazily to the side. Before Zalandov, she'd owned a pair of spectacles to help with her amblyopia, but they'd been damaged during the riot soon after her arrival. The glass trampled right out of them. She maintained that she could see just as well as anyone, but Kiva often heard her swearing when she knocked things over. He went out to prune the thistle wart shortly after you left, Kiva dear, but he didn't come back afterward, so I expect he ran off to get more of your rats. Unlike Nurgle, who went out of his way to be as useless as possible, Alicia at least tried to be helpful around the infirmary. If not for her chronic fear of illness and death, and her denial about her fallible vision, Kiva would have been much more grateful for her assistance. Instead, she often found that the two of them only added to her workload. But if nothing else, they stepped in when Kiva was needed elsewhere, and the reprieve they afforded her by covering the night shift was always appreciated. Did he say anything? Kiva asked Alicia, as the woman subtly dusted crumbs from her tunic. Kiva didn't care about the stolen food. Tilda was barely managing broth and was nowhere near up to eating bread crusts, but she did care about Tip. Nothing I can recall, sweets, Alicia said. Kiva frowned. And he hasn't been back all day, you're sure? Alicia looked uncertain, like she was second-guessing herself. I don't think so. She looked toward the rat pen, as if the answers lay within the vermin. You coming, Leash? Nurgle interrupted. It's nearly dinner time. Alicia smacked her lips together, acting like she hadn't eaten in 3 years, and glanced quickly at Kiva, seeking permission to leave. Barely refraining from rolling her eyes, Kiva said, Go, I won't need you during the day tomorrow, but I will on Thursday. See you then, Alicia said before hurrying after Nurgle, who had never paid any heed to Kiva's position of authority over him. She was a prisoner, just as he was. That was all he saw when he looked at her. Over the last few weeks, neither Alicia nor Nurgle had been asked a single question about the sickness that was spreading, or the research Kiva was doing. They hadn't even batted an eyelash upon first seeing the rat pen, as if she frequently conducted experiments in the middle of the quarantine room, so they didn't understand the severity of what was happening. Perhaps they didn't realize how rapidly it was spreading, how many were dying. Perhaps they simply didn't care, and therefore didn't want to be kept informed. Either way, Kiva wasn't sure if she was relieved not to have to answer their questions at the end of each day, or if she was annoyed that they weren't worried enough to offer more help. Placing her hands on her hips, Kiva looked around the infirmary and wondered aloud, Tip, where are you? With only Tilda in the room, no answer came, so Kiva shrugged and began organizing her samples before feeding them to the rats. She then noticed that she was nearly out of augury elixir, so after force-feeding Tilda some broth and checking on the quarantine patients, she followed Mott's instructions to brew the fresh potion. Most of the ingredients were already on her workbench, but the everberries and snow blossoms needed to be picked fresh from the garden. So Kiva gave the elixir a good stir and was just about to head outside to collect them when Jaren and Nari walked through the infirmary door. Perfect timing, Kiva said, Can one of you please stir this? She held out the ladle to Jaren. When he reached her first, he was covered in tunnel dust as usual, but the bruises and scrapes on his face from his altercation with Cresta's lackeys had healed, leaving just a thin-shaped scar over his left eye from the day he'd arrived at Zalandov. Back in a second, she said, pointing to the door leading to the medicinal garden. What no, hi, how was your day? He returned, sending her a tired but still teasing grin. I'd ask if I cared, Kiva threw over her shoulder as she walked away, not allowing him to see her smile. Nari caught it, though, her amber eyes sparkling as she took the ladle from Jaren and told him, Why don't you help Kiva with whatever she's doing? Everworld, help me, Kiva thought at Nari's lack of subtlety. Whatever might be going on between the guard and Jaren, it clearly wasn't stopping her from playing matchmaker. Maybe she hadn't lied about her relationship with him after all. I'm good, Kiva called back to them. I don't mind helping, Jaren said, as she heard his footsteps following her. Speaking of help, where's Tip? Kiva waited for Jaren by the door, then opened it for the both of them. Alicia said he took off this morning and didn't come back. I'm trying not to worry, but... She plucked at the fraying edge of her tunic. It's not like him, you know. Have you checked with Mott? Jaren asked. He might be with him in the morgue again. His eyes lit as he added, or playing another prank on him. Gosh, I hope not, Kiva groaned, walking out into the brisk night air and rubbing her arms against the chill, tall gabba grass rising up around them. They're finally on good terms after the last one. You have to admit, the kid has an imagination, Jaren said, chuckling. He certainly does, Kiva agreed. Quietly, she added. He was meant for more than this. The world needs people like him out there in it, shining light into the darkest places. He's wasted in here. He won't be here forever, Jaren replied just as quietly. Neither will you. Kiva turned to him, the moonlight shining down and accentuating his strong features. She never held much of an interest in art, but looking at him now, her fingers itched for some paint, for some charcoal, for anything that could capture his near-perfect angles. She wondered if he knew how appealing he was, wondered if before Zalandov he'd used his looks to his advantage. Perhaps that was what had led him here. An illicit liaison, or a secret affair, a courtier's daughter, a guard's sister, a nobleman's wife. Any of them could have cost him his freedom. Kiva didn't think that was it. While Jaren was roguishly charming, she doubted he had an unfaithful bone in his body. I hope you're right, Kiva said, looking away from him and down at the willow root saplings near her feet. Gentle fingers on her chin had her head tilting upward again, his hand cupping her face. Something to know about me, Kiva Meriden, Jaren said softly, is that I'm always right. Out of nowhere, Kiva's heart began to thump madly in her chest. It was so loud that she was sure Jaren might be able to hear it, but he gave no indication, only stared into her eyes, the moonlight flowing like liquid between them, dusting everything with a glittering bluish silver. Kiva was frozen to the spot, unsure if she wanted to push Jaren away or if she wanted to pull him closer. Her brain was screaming warnings at her, telling her she needed to keep her distance. The tunnel dust on his face, a damning reminder of where he worked and the odds of his survival. He, like all of Zalandov's labourers, had one foot in the grave, whether he knew it or not. But Cresta had survived for years working in the quarry, and a handful of other prisoners had defied certain death as well. Maybe Jaren would be among them. Maybe he would live long enough for it to count. Kiva, however, still had 2 ordeals to face, either of which could take her life, and if by some miracle she survived, she would then be free to leave Zalandov, never to see Jaren again. They were doomed to fail before they even started, and yet despite what her mind was telling her, despite all the rules she had carefully maintained for years, when he inched forward, Kiva didn't stop him. Her hand rose of its own accord, clutching his dirt-smeared tunic as she leaned into him, her knees wobbling as he continued closer, the distance between them. "Kiva," he whispered, his breath touching her lips. A shiver ran down her spine, her eyes drifting shut as one of his hands trailed through her hair, before continuing to rest at the base of her neck. "Kiva," he whispered again, "there's something I need to—" He broke off suddenly, his body tensing against hers. "Did you hear that?" Kiva's eyes flooded back open. Dazedly she asked, "Hear what?" But then she heard it, a low moaning sound. Jaren pointed deeper into the garden, the gabot grass obscuring their view. It came from over there. "Maybe it's Boots," Kiva offered. She'd been doing her best to keep the cat out of the infirmary and away from the rats, and the little beast was moodier than normal because of it. But even so, she'd never heard Boots make such a noise before. "Maybe," Jaren said, though he didn't sound convinced. The moan came again, and something about it struck Kiva as familiar. Too familiar. Ice flooded her veins, and without thinking, she took off into the darkness, hearing Jaren's footsteps right behind her. The garden was only small, so she barely had to round one bend before she skidded to a halt, finding the small body curled up on the ground beside the overgrown thistlewort bush, pale and shivering in the moonlight. It was Tip, and he was sick. Chapter 24. The night that followed was one of the worst Kiva had ever experienced. After Jaren sprinted back into the infirmary with Tip in his arms, Kiva helped lay him on the bed opposite Tilda, ignoring all quarantine procedures in favour of keeping him within reach at all times. His fever was off the charts, with him clutching his stomach and moaning, but otherwise unable to communicate anything to Kiva about what he was feeling. She forced remedy after remedy down his throat, half of which he vomited up, so in an act of desperation she cut open his forearm and shoved a small hollowed tube into his vein, funneling medicine directly into his bloodstream. She had attempted it with some of the ill patients without success. This was Tip. He had to survive. He had to. 3 hours passed. 6 hours. 12. Jaren and Nari stayed with Kiva, fetching her fresh water and clean linens, preparing medicines, removing buckets of sick. When the time came for Jaren to begin working in the tunnels, he didn't leave, and Nari didn't make him. The three of them remaining with Tip, watching the young boy, waiting for any sign of improvement or deterioration. Kiva couldn't stop berating herself for leaving the boy so alone, distracted as she'd been with her research and the ordeals. If only he'd gone with her to collect her samples yesterday, then maybe... It was useless, she knew. She had no idea what had made him sick, just as she had no idea what was making anyone sick. She called herself a healer, but what did she really know? She'd never had any official training, nor had she apprenticed under a master or studied at an academy. All she knew was what her father had taught her in the short time they'd had together, and with such limited resources, nothing had prepared her for an illness of this magnitude. For how many people were dying without any known cause? For the possibility of losing another person she loved. Her father had already succumbed to this sickness. She couldn't stand the thought that Tip might soon follow in his footsteps. Kiva? Kiva's head shot upwards. Confusion fogged her mind before adrenaline cleared it, making her realize that she dozed off with her cheek on Tip's bed, her sleepless night and the long hours of the previous day having caught up to her. "Tip," she gasped, reaching for his hand. They were ice cold, but also clammy with sweat. She frowned at the sensation, since none of the other sick patients had exhibited a similar symptom. But she cast it from her mind and focused on the young boy, staring at her with tears in his scared blue eyes. "Am I going to die?" "Of course not," Kiva had told him sternly, as if the idea was preposterous, even if every part of her was was shriveling on the inside. 2 sets of footsteps approached her from behind, belonging to Jaren and Nari. Strong hands came to rest on her shoulders, and a whiff of honey, ginger, and mint touched her nose. Ingredients she'd asked Jaren to mix into a healing tea in the hope that Tip might be able to drink some. "Hey, buddy, looking good," Jaren said from over Kiva's shoulder. Jaren, Tip said, his pale lips stretching into a smile. It made him look even more sickly, like the effort cost him dearly. "You're here!" "Where else would I be?" Jaren said, letting go of Kiva to crouch beside the bed. "This is where all the fun is." Tip laughed, a low, almost painful sound. Kiva wasn't sure if she wanted Jaren to shut up and go away so the young boy could rest, or if it was more important for him to lift Tip's spirits and give him a fighting chance. "And Nari too," Tip said, looking over Kiva's shoulder to where the guard stood. "I wouldn't try talking to her," Jaren warned conspiratorially. "She skipped breakfast, so you know what that means." Tip's smile widened, a hint of light touching his cloudy eyes. "Hungry?" Jaren nodded solemnly. "And angry. She's worse than a wooker after hibernation." Nari made a grumbling noise from behind Kiva, but Tip laughed again, this time not sounding so painful. Kiva had to bite her cheek to keep in her tears, the sight of him so animated, so alive, while also looking so small in the infirmary bed, was also too much for her to bear. "What do you think about some tea?" Kiva asked, her voice wobbling only a little. "Jaren made it, so there's a good chance it'll make you feel worse." "Hey, but it should help soothe your tummy a bit," Kiva continued, over Jaren's protest. "Sound good?" Tip curled in on himself, as if daunted by the idea of trying to ingest anything after having brought so much up in a short period of time, and yet he still said, "I can try." Kiva heard the distress in his voice, even if he tried to hide it. She wanted to tell him they could try later, but he desperately needed some fluids. Dehydration would only make him feel worse. "Just a little," Kiva said, as Jaren rose from his crouch and went to collect the brew. "A few sips." But Tip wasn't able to manage a few sips. He was gagging after the first one, tears streaming down his cheeks as he apologized over and over. "Shh, it's all right," Kiva told him, sitting on the bed beside him and running her hands through his sweaty hair. "I'm sorry," he cried. "I tried." He looked at her through watery eyes, filled with fear, as he sobbed. "I don't want to die." Kiva swallowed back her own sob, her heart aching. She kept her face void of all that she was feeling, hiding her dread and panic, and broke all her rules by lying down and pulling him into her arms. His small, feverish body burrowed into hers, clutching tightly like she was his only lifeline left in the world. "I'm here," Kiva whispered as he trembled against her, his tears and sweat soaking into her tunic. "I'm here, Tip." She kept repeating herself, reminding him that she was there, that she wouldn't leave him, until he finally cried himself into an exhausted sleep. Even then, Kiva didn't let him go. Holding him close, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, the steadiness of his breathing, the life that remained within him for however long he had left. "Kiva," she looked away from the boy in her arms and up at Jaren, his tender concern prompting tears to pool in her eyes. She tore her gaze away, carefully extricating herself from Tip's hold and tucking the blankets around him, just as Jaren had done for her 11 days earlier. I need... Kiva couldn't finish a sentence, her throat painfully tight. Her throat painfully tight as she tried to keep her tears from overflowing. Unable to look at Jaren again, and the compassion she knew she'd see on his face, she turned to Nari and said, "We need more gingerweed." When the guard made a move toward the door, Kiva threw out her hand. "No, I'll get it. Can you just watch him for a minute, both of you? I'll be right back." and without waiting for them to agree, Kiva took off across the infirmary and out the door into the medicinal garden. "Kiva," Sharon called after her. "Kiva, wait." She didn't wait, not even when she heard him following. She kept going, rounding the bend until she reached the thistlewort, the place where they'd found Tip the previous night, now bathed in soft morning sunlight. Kiva stopped, a hand on her shoulder. That was all it took for her to crumble. Jaron caught her before her knees could hit the dirt, turning her in his arms and pulling her close, as the tears she'd been trying so hard to keep in began to stream like rivers down her face. "I can't lose him," she cried into his chest. Jaron held her tighter, rubbing her back soothingly. "Shh, I got you." Tear after tear fell from Kiva, all her fear and sorrow flooding out of her until finally her sobbing eased, giving way to exhaustion. In a rasping whisper of a voice, her words full of anguish, Kiva repeated, "I can't lose him, Jaron." "I know," he whispered back, still holding her close, his arms curled tightly around her. She pulled away just enough to look up at him, meeting his concerned blue-gold gaze. "You don't know," she said hoarsely. "I can't lose him." Jaron reached for her face, gently wiping her tears away. "Sweetheart, I know." "He's like a brother to me," she said, unable to keep from acknowledging the truth, the depth of care she had for the young boy. "I can't," she broke off in another sob, but then she caught hold of herself, breathing deeply. "I can't lose another brother. I just can't." And that's when it came pouring out of her, the story of how Karen had been killed to keep their father from being arrested. How Kiva had been swept away to Zalendorf with Farron, only to lose him less than a year later. The whole time she spoke, Jaron held her against his chest, embracing her in his solid, comforting warmth. When finally the last of her tears fell and the tension left her body, she didn't have it in her to feel embarrassed, not on top of every other emotion she was dealing with. She did, however, manage to step out of Jaron's arms and whispered, "Sorry." He shook his head. "Never apologize for loving someone, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." Kiva inhaled deeply, and in an effort to keep the tears from starting all over again, enough crying, as long as there was breath in Tip's body, she would not give up on him. He was young, he was healthy. If anyone could survive this, it was him. He had to survive this. "We should get back in there," she said, pointing to the infirmary. I just need a minute." She made herself meet Jaron's eyes. "Thank you for being here." "I'm not going anywhere, Kiva," he said softly. "You're not in this alone. Any of it." She swallowed and nodded, unable to offer a verbal response, but still trying to convey how grateful she was to have him by her side. "Come on, let's go make sure Nari hasn't accidentally set the rats free," Jaron said, taking Kiva's hand and leading her back along the path. "The last thing we need is for Tip to wake up and start chasing them all around the infirmary." A small laugh left Kiva, slightly hollow, but still genuine. She clung to his offer of levity, pushing away her fear, her grief, and shared. "He had a chest infection about 2 years ago, and I swear he was the worst patient I've ever seen. I couldn't keep him in his bed. He always had something he needed to do, somewhere he needed to be. I nearly had to strap him down just to get him to sleep." She smiled softly at the memory. "If we'd had rats then, he would have been a nightmare, wanting to play with them all the time. I'd have had no chance at keeping him under control." Jaron chuckled. "Just you wait then. If that's the kind of fighting spirit he has, I'm sure he'll be back on his feet in no time." It was an empty promise, but it was exactly what Kiva needed to hear as they reached the doorway to the infirmary, and she prepared herself for what might come over the next few hours. "You ready?" Jaron asked, squeezing her fingers. "No," Kiva said truthfully, "but I want to be with him." And so they re-entered the infirmary together, and Kiva spent the rest of the day watching over Tip, willing him to fight, willing him to live. Hours passed as the shadows shifted across the room until suddenly it was night again. Kiva wasn't sure whether to be relieved or concerned that Tip hadn't awoken since the morning. She remained in a vigil beside him, leaving only for brief periods to check on Tilda and her other patients. 7 more were admitted into her care, and 9 more passed away. The numbers continuing to grow every day. When Mott came to collect the dead, he didn't ask any questions of Kiva, with Nari and Jaren having already filled him in. He did stand behind her for a while, though, offering silent companionship as they looked down at the small boy, counting his breaths. "He's strong, love," Mott said, his hand steady on her shoulder. "If anyone can pull through, it's our Tip." Kiva only nodded, then listened as Mott's footsteps faded along with the morgue workers he'd brought to carry the bodies away. She didn't allow herself to wonder how long it would be before they came for Tip, or how she would cope when that moment arrived. It was just before midnight when Tip stirred again. Kiva was in the middle of brewing herself some yellow nut tea, just desperate for an energy boost, since she was barely able to keep her eyes open. Nari and Jaren were slumped on stools, leaning against the work table, both of them looking as tired as she felt. But still, they were with her, holding true to Jaren's promise that she wouldn't be alone. "Is it morning?" Kiva looked over to find Tip pushing himself up in bed. She lowered her infuser and rushed to his bedside, Nari and Jaren right on her heels. "Not yet," Kiva answered, pressing her hand to his forehead. She wondered if maybe he was a little cooler than earlier, but that was likely wishful thinking on her part. "How are you feeling?" Tip's face fell as if he suddenly remembered where he was and why, and he curled in a little more on himself. "No, just my tummy. Sorry, my tummy hurts." "And your head?" Kiva asked, her fingers still warm from his fevered skin. "No, just my tummy." Kiva's brow furrowed. "Are you sure it doesn't hurt here?" She touched the side of his face near his temple. Tip shook his head and repeated, "Just my tummy." Kiva removed her hand, looking at him closely. All of the other sick prisoners had horrible headaches accompanying their stomach pains, including the new patients who had arrived that day. It was one of the earliest symptoms they experienced, along with their rising temperatures. Reaching for Tip's blanket, Kiva pushed it aside and lifted the hem of his tunic, ignoring his weak protest when she raised it enough to expose the flesh of his abdomen. No rash. His skin was smooth. Kiva tucked his blanket back in, offering his arms a quick, comforting squeeze to say she was done, her mind whirling as she sought to put a timeline on what she knew of the sickness. Fever, headaches, and vomiting came first. The rash usually appeared within 24 hours. Kiva didn't know at what point yesterday Tip had been struck by the illness, but she'd left early in the morning with Nari. If he'd gone out to the garden shortly afterward, as Alicia had claimed, then he'd already passed the 24-hour mark. Even the 36-hour mark and beyond. He should have a rash by now, and he should have had a raging headache since the beginning. Maybe it was because he was young, the sickness taking longer to flood his system, with the missing symptoms still to come. And yet Kiva recalled something her father had told her when trying to explain the difference age could play in the illness. "Children often get it worse," he said, brushing his knuckles down her rosy cheek. "It comes on you fast and hard, but leaves that way too. Then you're up and bouncing around much quicker than us oldies, fully recovered in what feels like the blink of an eye, while we're still miserable as we wait for the lingering dregs to leave our system." Winking at her, he'd finished, "Cherish the gift of youth while you still have it, little mouse." If her father was right, and he always was when it came to healing, then Tip should be considerably worse than he currently was. Kiva didn't want to give herself false hope, but what if Tip wasn't sick, or at least wasn't sick with whatever was spreading around the prison? His symptoms were similar, but that was the problem Kiva had faced all along, that the symptoms were so generic they could have been caused by a number of ailments, from viruses to allergies to something as simple as having eaten spoiled food. There was no way to know for sure, nothing to do except write it out and see what happened over the next few hours. And so Kiva sat back down beside him, clutching his hands with hers, and waited. 4 hours later, Tip's fever broke. His stomach stopped hurting. He asked for some bread. He wanted to play with the rats. Kiva wept. Yay! Tip's okay. At least for now, anyway. He's 74. 68% of the way. So, let's get some cookies. Let's spend some cookies. Let's get a prism. Hey? Achievement unlocked. 2 achievements. Lone photon and 1 with everything. Oh. 1 with everything. Have at least 1 of every building. And have 1 prism. So yeah, that must be all that there is then. There must not be any other, there must not be any other buildings to be unlocked. Which is good. We are getting there. I have 100 curses. Where's the clicking? 100 factories, 100 farms. 7. Let's go up to 90. 90 mines, and then we'll read another 2 chapters, and then we might call it for the night. Well, let's just leave it there, actually. I'll get the other 2 after, because it's going to take ages. So we'll read another 2 chapters, and then call it for the night. So I'll just have a quick flick forward. Okay. Chapter 25. If you don't go, I'll push you out the door myself. Kiva pulled a face at Tip, the young boy standing with his hands on his hips beside the rat pen, staring at her like a disgruntled puppy. It was 3 days since she'd found him passed out in the garden. The first day had been hell, with her certain that he would soon be heading to the morgue. But after his fever broke late that night, he'd improved dramatically, and it had been a struggle to keep him resting, as what remained of the short-term bug he'd caught left his body. The only way she'd managed to keep him in bed was by promising to test the samples she'd collected the day he'd fallen ill, having put them aside to care for him. She'd completed her other tests yesterday, under his watchful eye, the 2 of them alone in the infirmary, with Jaren having gone back to the tunnels and Nari accompanying him to smooth out any wrinkles caused by his absence. Kiva was beyond the point of questioning the guard's motives, and was now just grateful for the unexpected ally she'd become. for all of them. But today, since the most recent tests had failed yet again, Nari had arrived at the infirmary early that morning, reminding Kiva that she still had more samples to collect. And despite Kiva's protests that she needed to remain with Tip in case of a relapse, the young boy refused to allow her to stay behind and coddle him for another day. Your next ordeal is tomorrow, Kiva, Tip said. You need to test the aquifer and the tunnels so that you're done. I'm fine, so stop worrying and just go. He pointed to the door, as if doing so would help convince her. Don't worry, sweets, I'll keep an eye on him, Alicia said, having arrived with Nurgle to cover the day shift. The offer was meant to reassure Kiva, but the last time Alicia had watched over Tip, he had collapsed out in the freezing cold, entirely forgotten. As such, Kiva didn't have much confidence in the woman's ability to monitor him. Tip sighed and said, I won't leave the infirmary, I promise. Not even if there's a fire. Kiva frowned. Please do leave if there's a fire. Fine, but aside from that, I won't move. I'll keep Boots away from the rats, and I'll make sure Tilda eats something. I'll even try to get Nurgle to do some work. The man in question made a harump sound, and proceeded to clean his fingernails while Alicia sniggered at his side. How about you take a nap? Kiva suggested instead. Sleep is good for you. I've been sleeping for days. I'm all but better now. Kiva, he held up his hands out to his sides, fit as a fiddle. It was true that Tip had made an amazing recovery, to the point that it was almost impossible to believe that she'd feared he was on his deathbed only a few days earlier. But that didn't mean she wasn't struggling with the all-consuming terror she'd experienced at the thought of losing him. If you feel even the slightest bit unwell, I'll have someone come to get you, Tip said, rolling his eyes. I know. Kiva ignored the eye roll and stepped closer, pulling him into a tight hug. He froze in her arms before his hands came around her and he hugged her back. This is nice, he said, his words muffled by her tunic. We should do this more often. Kiva laughed and pushed him away, pointing a finger toward the bed he'd used since falling ill. Rest. I mean it. He rolled his eyes for the second time, but he trudged obediently to the bed and sat down. How long he'd stay there, Kiva didn't know, but she trusted that he wouldn't break his word and leave the infirmary while she was gone. I'll be back as soon as possible, Kiva told Alicia and Nurgle, the former nodding in reply, the latter giving an uncaring lift of his shoulders. Kiva hurried over to where Nari was waiting at the door, following the guard out into the crisp morning and toward the centre of the prison grounds. So you're testing the water today? Nari asked. That's really all that's left, Kiva said. That and the tunnels. We're heading there as well? Kiva nodded. Everything left is underground, so we might as well check a few of the passageways straight after the aquifer and the pumping station, then we'll be done. Done? Nari repeated. As in, done? Unless you can think of somewhere else that should be tested, Kiva said. Then yes, done. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that everything was riding on today's samples. If the rats didn't show any symptoms by tomorrow, then her attempt at finding the origin of the illness would have failed. Don't think about it, Nari said, reading Kiva's mind. Water can host all kinds of bacteria. I'm sure you'll find something today. Kiva appreciated her confidence, and was about to say as much when an angry voice yelled her name. They were halfway across the open space between the infirmary and the domed building at the centre of the prison, where the ground was muddy, the grass patchy, and mostly dead. There was little else nearby, the closest building being a watchtower, which was why Kiva was surprised to turn and see Cresta marching in their direction. The woman's hands clenched into fists by her sides. Where the hell do you think you're going? Kiva's brows rose. Excuse me? Cresta came to a stop in front of Kiva, pointing a finger straight up at her face. Nari edged closer, but didn't interfere. "My friends are sick and dying," Cresta said, moving her finger back toward the infirmary. "And you're out here doing what? What are you doing, healer? 'Cause you damn well aren't making any of them better." At first, Kiva was relieved, having feared Cresta had approached to remind her that Tilda needed to stay alive, and Tip's life would be forfeited if Kiva failed tomorrow's task. Never mind that Kiva's life would also be forfeited. They were all linked now. Cresta had no need to continue threatening her. But then Kiva processed what the irate woman had said, and a heavy feeling hit her stomach. This wasn't about protecting the rebel queen at all. This was about something beyond one person, beyond any of them, rebels included. "Cresta, don't you Cresta me," the young woman spat, her expression so livid that her serpent tattoo looked like it would rise out of her face and strike at Kiva. "You want to know what just happened? Typhon dropped like a slab of aluminium halfway to the quarry. Couldn't get up again, shaking, puking everywhere. Harlow let me drag him back, but only so he could follow and stare at my backside the whole way. The perverted—" "Where's Typhon now?" Kiva interrupted, cringing at the thought of the repugnant quarrymaster. Cresta pointed toward the infirmary again. "He's where you should be, but you're not. You're here." She slammed her finger toward the earth, silently demanding an answer. "I'm working to fix this," Kiva said cautiously. "To fix what?" Cresta shoved her matted red hair over her shoulder. "This stomach virus?" "Yes," Kiva said, not offering any more and wondering when Nari was going to step in and stop this. Cresta's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." Kiva raised her hands. "I'm not. Why do you think I was at the quarry? I was collecting samples for testing, just like I am today." She patted the bag on her shoulder. "That was over a fortnight ago," Cresta explained. "More and more people are dying every day. Heck, everyone who comes to see you for the smallest thing ends up getting sick. Explain that, healer. Are you telling me you're still trying to figure out why?" Kiva didn't have a response, unsure what she was allowed to say, especially with someone as volatile as Cresta. If the rebel leader used this to stir up more dissent among the prisoners, if she tried to create panic, things were already brewing too close to the surface, with whispers circulating about what had happened 9 years earlier, the same spreading sickness, the same mass deaths. The murmurs were growing, the fears deepening. If something didn't calm the inmates soon— "I think you should be getting back to the quarry now," Nari said, clearly thinking along the same lines. "Where's Harlow?" "Where do you think?" Cresta asked, one hand on her hip. "He's in the kitchen, stealing from our rations. Like you lot don't get enough of our food as it is." Her face darkened. "He's probably getting handsy with the workers there at the same time. So trust me, he'll be in no rush to leave." Nara's expression tightened, her eyes blazing as she turned to Kiva. "I'll meet you at the tunnel entrance. Don't go down without me." To Cresta, Nari said, "Come with me." And without another word, she strode off in the direction of the kitchens, not waiting to see if Cresta would obey. "If she weren't a guard, I think I'd like her," the angry woman mused. But then she remembered who she was standing with, and she sneered at Kiva. "Fix this, healer, before we all die. Our blood is on your hands." With that parting line, she turned and began marching away. "Wait," Kiva called. Cresta paused, glancing over her shoulder. "What?" Aware that she had mere seconds before Nari became suspicious of the delay, Kiva closed the distance between them and whispered, "Have you heard anything about Tilda, about another rescue attempt?" Cresta's features were like granite as she forced out a single word. "No." Kiva's shoulders slumped, even if she'd already assumed as much. "What does that mean?" "It means we wait," Cresta said, "and you do what you're supposed to. Keep her alive until the time comes." With a sharp warning look, Cresta took off again, leaving Kiva alone. "That's easier said than done," she muttered to herself. Not only did she have to survive tomorrow's trial, she also had to keep both herself and Tilda from catching the stomach illness, without knowing how it spread to begin with. And if she somehow managed those, she then would have to face yet another ordeal in a fortnight. Kiva sighed and rubbed her temples. As far as confrontations with Cresta went, that one hadn't been so bad. She felt a niggling of concern in the pit of her stomach, wondering what the rebel leader might do with the information she had learned about the sickness, limited as it had been. Anyone else, and Kiva wouldn't have been so worried, but Cresta, she was a wild card. It was possible that she would do nothing, keeping her head down and focusing her energy on what was happening with the rebels, both inside and outside of the walls, or she could use what she'd heard to add to the fear spreading among the prisoners, creating a dangerous environment where everyone was even more on edge, guards included. Sighing again, Kiva knew it was out of her hands. So she hitched her bag further up her shoulder and continued her journey to the tunnel entrance. Refocusing on her mission, both the aquifer and the pumping station were accessed via the same shaft that led down the tunnels, so once she reached the domed stone building, she stepped inside to wait for Nari. There was nothing to look at, only a set of ladders poking out from the large rectangular hole on the ground. The guard arrived minutes later, her face stormy. "Please tell me Harlow's rash is painful as well as itchy." Kiva swallowed and laughed and said, "Judging by how he winces when he walks, I'm guessing so." "Good," Nari said, sounding satisfied. She jerked her head toward the ladders, descending into the shaft. "Let's get this over with." They headed to the pumping station first, but only for convenience reasons, since it was located nearest to the bottom of the ladder, or ladders, really, since there were a number of them, to climb down before reaching the tunnel floor, all connected by platforms narrow enough that Kiva felt her stomach jump into her throat every time she transferred from one to the next. She ventured beneath Zalandov only twice before, both times to test the water in the aquifer for algae and other natural contaminants, and both journeys had been just as harrowing as today. Her legs felt like custard when she finally touched the earth at the base of the shaft, perspiration dotting her forehead from both exertion and the humidity that clung to her skin. She'd once believed the tunnels would be much colder than the outside temperature, but she'd learned during her first underground venture that hot air became trapped more easily, keeping the environment almost balmy in winter and downright uncomfortable in summer. Many of the prisoners who worked below ground suffered from heat-related ailments and dehydration, especially in the warmer months. Not to mention it was a stink factory, with all those bodies pressed together and labouring side by side with little ventilation. "I hate it down here," Nari stated, landing lightly beside Kiva. "I don't know how anyone can stand it." "They can't," Kiva wanted to say. "That's why so many of them die. The prisoners, at least. The guards rotated out every few shifts. Even Nari came and went only sporadically from the tunnels, spending considerably more time topside than she did beneath the earth." Kiva tried not to judge her for it, especially since she herself had been so fortunate with her own work allocation. But it was hard acknowledging that the guard wasn't forced to remain down here all day, when people like Jaren had no choice. "Let's keep moving," Kiva said, stepping forward. She spared a glance to the right, where a long passageway had been carved out, luminous beacons affixed to the limestone walls and lighting the space that continued on out of sight. Later, Kiva and Nari would head down that path, eventually hearing the echo of the tunnelers working tirelessly to extend the labyrinth. Some of the passages were dry and could be walked down, but others the inmates laboured to uncover were partially submerged by water and required floating paddleboards to maneuver along. That was the water that led into the aquifer and ultimately kept everyone in Zalandov alive. No one acknowledged it, but without the tunnelers and the water they found and guided to the aquifer, every single person at the prison, guards included, would be dead within days. This was why it was so important to have a steady flow of labourers underground, despite the poor conditions and the high mortality rate. It made Kiva feel sick, and yet she also understood what would happen if they stopped searching for more water. There was no winning. Either a few died, or they all died. As Kiva led Nari down the narrow passageway to the left of the ladder shaft, The sound of the pumping station met their ears long before they reached their destination. Operated manually with 2 prisoners and a pump, the continuous up and down motion drove the water where it needed to. Some of the pumps pulled water from the tunnels into the aquifer, but most siphoned water into smaller wells that were then accessed above ground, like the ones used by prisoners to fetch fresh drinking water. Others fed directly into the shower blocks and bathing chambers, where gravity-fed pipes did the rest of the work. Anywhere water was used, it was only because of the labourers who were pumping day and night to keep a steady supply available topside. Kiva always struggled when pumpers came into the infirmary, usually for nerve damage to their hands or for strained backs, necks, and shoulders. There was little she could do for them other than offer painkillers, and after a while the effect of those began to dull, which was why so many pumpers became addicted to harder drugs, like angel dust. Unlike Kiva's predecessor, she'd never been willing to supply it for them. She'd had no idea how it was getting into their hands now, but seeing their glazed eyes as she began to fold the equipment and collect her samples, she knew they were still obtaining it somehow. Feeling the desolation in the air, Kiva didn't stay long in the pumping station, quickly taking what she needed, while Nari conversed with the guards on duty. They weren't using their whips, but they didn't need to. These prisoners were already broken. I asked if the pumpers get allocated extra rations, Nari said as they headed down the next passage, the sounds of moving levers and strained moans fading the further they travelled. Kiva tried not to reveal her shock at what Nari had just said. And the guard shook her head and repeated, "I hate it down here." It was only a short walk between the pumping station and the aquifer. As the narrow passageway widened and the reservoir came into view, Kiva's heart began to beat faster in her chest. The aluminium beacons were spaced intermittently enough to provide only limited light, but there was still enough spread throughout the underground chasm for Kiva to acknowledge just how far the body of water stretched. Further than she could see, with the darkness indicating an equally nightmarish depth. "Is something wrong?" Kiva turned to find Nari studying her closely, so she asked somewhat nonsensical, "It's here, isn't it?" The aluminium beacons cast shadows over Nari's face, but not enough to hide her puzzled look. "What's here? The origin of the sickness? Isn't that what we're trying to figure out?" Kiva shook her head. "No, tomorrow's ordeal. Is it being held down here?" It was still her best guess, enough that she felt queasy as she looked in the seemingly endless underground lake. Nari's features cleared with understanding, and she glanced out across the aquifer as if looking at it from a new perspective. "I don't know." Kiva wasn't sure what her face must have shown, but when Nari looked back at her, the guard was quick to say, "I swear, Kiva, I didn't know what the last 2 trials were beforehand either. If I knew what tomorrow's task was, I'd tell you." Her tone was so earnest that Kiva believed her. A few weeks ago she never would have had the courage to even ask, but somehow Nari had become one of the people Kiva trusted most in the world. If the guard said she didn't know, then she didn't know. But that still didn't help Kiva at all. "How long do you think it'd take to swim across?" Kiva asked, crouching beside the nearest edge of water and scooping some up into a flask, careful not to lose her balance. "Frankly, I don't want to think about it," Nari said with a shudder to her normally unwavering voice. Seeing Kiva's expression, she hastily added, "But I'm sure it won't take too long if that's what you have to do. And it's fresh water, so there's nothing nasty living down here. No sea monsters or crocodilians or any other saltwater beasts." That idea hadn't even crossed Kiva's mind. She yanked her hand from the water and backed away quickly, half expecting a maw full of teeth to come raging out of the surface. "At least the water's drinkable," Nari tried, when she realized she'd only added to Kiva's distress. "You won't get thirsty if you have to swim for hours." "You think you're helping, but you're not," Kiva said flatly. Nari remained blessedly quiet as Kiva collected the rest of her samples, after which they retraced their steps along the narrow passageway. Both were lost in their own thoughts, with Kiva lingering back at the aquifer and worrying about what she'd have to do the next day. Obsessing over it failed to provide her with any answers as they passed the pumping station and headed back to the entrance shaft. Their intent had been to venture down the larger passageway into the tunnel labyrinth next so that Kiva could collect the last of her samples, but that plan changed when they found Alicia waiting for them at the base of the ladders. "I didn't know which way you'd gone. I thought it best if I stayed here until you returned," the woman explained, wringing her hands. Kiva couldn't think past the panic that sprang to life within her, all thoughts of tomorrow's trial fleeing her mind. "Is it Tip? Is he sick again?" "Oh no, dear, it's not Tip." "Is it his stomach?" Kiva asked, not listening, just reaching for the bottom rungs of the ladder and preparing to bolt up them and back to the infirmary. "Did his fever come back?" "Kiva, sweets," Alicia said, stopping her with a hand on her arm. "It's not Tip, it's Tilda." A wave of relief flooded Kiva, before it was swept away by one of dread. "Did she have another convulsion? She's fine," Alicia interrupted in a calming voice. Confused, Kiva released the ladder and looked to Nari, who appeared equally perplexed. Turning back to Alicia, Kiva said, "Then why are you here?" "Because she's awake. Tilda's awake." Even more, Kiva confused. "She wakes up a few times every day." She paused, then added, "See if you can feed her some broth before she goes back to sleep. We need to keep up her fluids." "No, dear, you don't understand," Alicia said impatiently. She held Kiva's eyes as she explained, "Tilda's awake, and she's lucid." Bum, bum, bum. Chapter 26. Kiva struggled to control her breathing as she, Nari, and Alicia climbed up the ladder shaft, having determined to come back later for the remaining tunnel samples. Finally, the three of them reached the surface, panting and sweating with their muscles on fire, or Kiva and Alicia at least. Nari was barely out of breath, the picture of physical fitness. If Kiva hadn't been in such a rush to get back to the infirmary, she would have asked for more details about her prosthesis and how it worked so effortlessly, the guard having had no trouble gripping the ladder, nor anything else she set her hand to do. Ignoring her body's need for a moment of respite, Kiva strode out of the domed building with Nari at her side, Alicia breathlessly calling that she'd catch up. Unsure what she would find, unsure what she wanted to find, Kiva's mind was awhirl with thoughts, concerns, and questions by the time they arrived at the infirmary and stepped inside. "Kiva, you're back," Tip called, sitting beside Tilda's bed holding one of her hands. Kiva's heart gave a pang as the woman's face turned, not quite in the right direction, owing to her blindness, but close. Swallowing, Kiva moved first to place her samples from the pumping station at Aquifer on the workbench, finding Nurgle on a stool there, right where she'd left him. "You can go," she said to him. "Tell Alicia too. She's on her way back from the tunnels." The man was up and out of the infirmary so fast that it was as if he feared she'd change her mind. But Kiva didn't want him here for this, nor Alicia. In an ideal world, Tip and Nari wouldn't even be in the room, allowing Kiva a private moment with her patient. But Tip was already talking to Tilda, and Nari was striding toward her bed. The guard's features wary enough that Kiva assumed she was recalling the rebel queen's unprovoked attack soon after her arrival. Tilda had been restrained ever since, but Nari was no doubt still on high alert. Kiva's heart was thundering in her ears as she walked on wooden legs over to Tilda's bedside. She wasn't sure why she was so nervous. No, that wasn't true. There were so many reasons, not the least of which was if Tilda remembered anything before she'd arrived at Zalandov. And did she know about the note from Kiva's sister? Did she know Zulika had sent it? And Kiva had risked everything and was still risking everything to keep her alive. And what about her followers inside the walls? Did she know they'd tried to free her, or that they'd failed? Did she know Did she know if they had a backup plan, or was it just a fool's hope on Kiva's part? So many questions, none of which she would ask while Tip and Nari were present. Approaching with courage she didn't feel, Kiva stepped past the guard, who was looking down at the woman with a closed, distrustful expression, and stopped at Tip's shoulder. "I hear someone's feeling a little better," Kiva said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "She hasn't really said anything," Tip shared. "Just asked where she was and for some water." Kiva felt a pang of alarm, since the last time Tilda had been even remotely lucid, she'd known she was in Zalandov, until she hadn't, forgetting just moments later. It was good that she wanted water, though. Everworld knew Kiva was having trouble keeping her hydrated. "Kiva," the woman said. "Kiva." "That's right," Tip said encouragingly, patting her hand. "This is Kiva, the prison healer. I told you about her, remember? Kiva Meriden, the best healer in all of Wenderall. She's been looking after you." "Kiva," Tilda said, staring sightlessly in the direction of Tip's voice. Kiva's nails dug into her palms at the sound of her name coming from Tilda's lips. Despite Alicia's summons, the rebel queen didn't seem wholly lucid at all. Or perhaps she was again having trouble with her speech, as she had the last time Kiva had tried speaking with her a few weeks earlier. "Have you given her any gumwort?" Kiva asked Tip. His eyes lit up and he released Tilda's hand, jumping up from his stool and hurrying over to the workbench to collect the sludgy brown paste. He then handed it to Kiva and she smeared some on Tilda's tongue, willing to see if it would afford her any clarity and relax her mouth. "Kiva," the rebel queen said after a few moments, no longer slurring the words, but still saying nothing else. "She's here," Tip said, "and Nari as well. I told you about her too. She's a guard, but she's nice. You'll like her." Tilda turned her face this way and that, as if trying to see them. Kiva again wondered how long she'd been without vision, whether it was a side effect of whatever ailed her, or if she'd lost her sight some time ago. "Can you tell me how you're feeling?" Kiva made herself ask, determined to remember that she was the healer and she had a job to do. "Headache, nausea, pain anywhere? You've been here for nearly 6 weeks, and I still haven't been able to figure out what's wrong with you. Anything you could help me? You could tell to help me?" "The trials," Tilda said. "Why haven't they come for me?" Kiva, Tip, and Nari were all silent, none of them knowing what to say. "Why am I still alive?" Tip shifted on his stool. Nari crossed, uncrossed, and crossed her arms again. "I should be dead." Those 4 words tore something in Kiva, not the statement of fact, but the emotion behind them. She remembered what Tilda had said during their previous conversation. "Why keep me alive? Only so I can die?" Tears prickled behind Kiva's nose as the thought hit her hard and true. It sounded like Tilda wanted to die, like many who came to Zalandov. It sounded like she had nothing to live for, nothing to make her want to survive. But Kiva knew that wasn't the case. As the rebel queen, she had a purpose. She had people looking up to her. She had a kingdom to reclaim. She should have been the last person in the world to want to die, not before fighting with everything she had to take back her family's crown. "Kiva, why?" Tilda asked, her words begging as sweat began to glisten on her brow, the effort of this conversation costing her. "Why what?" Nari asked, speaking for the first time. Kiva jumped, almost having forgotten the guard was monitoring them, watching closely. "Why?" Tilda repeated, emotion threading her voice. "I think she wants to know why she's still here, still alive, Tip whispered, even though they already knew that was what she'd asked. Kiva, however, wondered if Tilda sought a different answer, one that she couldn't give her. I'm sorry, Kiva said, around the lump in her throat. I'm not sure why you're sick, but I'm doing everything I can to help you get better, including taking on Tilda's sentence as her own. But Kiva didn't plan to reveal that. And a quick warning look at both Tip and Nari silenced them as well. That's why you're still here, Tip said in an upbeat voice. Because of Kiva, she'll have you feeling like your old self in no time. A low moan left Tilda, the sound piercing straight to Kiva's heart. Kiva, the woman moaned, her voice trailing into a whisper. Kiva. What's wrong with her? Nari asked quietly. She's sick, Kiva said, barely keeping from snapping. A loaded pause from Nari before she cautiously, almost gently said, I know she's sick, Kiva. I meant, why does she keep saying your name like that? Kiva only shook her head, unable to say anything around her constricted throat. Tell me the story, Tilda said, closing her eyes and laying her head back. Nari and Tip both frowned with confusion, but Kiva had to breathe deeply to hold in the tears that were no longer just prickling her nose, but stinging her eyes. This woman, this poor sick woman, Kiva didn't know how long she had left, didn't know what she could do to help her. Your father, Kiva, Tilda said, raising a weak, trembling hand toward her, and the thief. Tell me the story. Kiva swallowed, then swallowed again. It was painful, like glass working its way down her esophagus. Her own fingers shook as she took Tilda's office hand gently in her own, knowing it was what the woman wanted. What's she talking about? Nari asked. Finally forcing words through her lips, Kiva said, I told her a story the day before the fire ordeal. She wasn't sleeping well, restless, groaning. I thought it might help. I like stories, Tip said eagerly. Will you tell it again? Kiva looked at the young boy and his open expression to Nari, who appeared curious but no longer wary, and then to Tilda, who seemed near to falling back asleep, where Kiva knew the delirium would overcome her again. Perhaps it was for the best that the rebel queen was unable to communicate properly. Perhaps even for the best that she was ill and confined to the infirmary. Not only was she protected from any anti-rebel inmates who wished her harm, but she also couldn't be sent to the abyss and interrogated until Kiva finished the trials. Tilda remained a prisoner, her life at risk as long as she was inside Zalandorf. There was no sign that her followers are coming for her the second time. It was Kiva's success or failure that would mean Tilda's execution or release. And until either outcome occurred, the sick woman was in danger. All of her rebellious knowledge trapped within her mind. Maybe that was why she was still so unwell, because on a subconscious level she knew what would happen if they tried to pry those secrets from her. Maybe that was why she wanted to die, to protect her plans, to take back the kingdom, and to protect all those she cared about. But Kiva also had people she cared about, and for better or worse, Tilda was one of those people. As long as Kiva remained alive, she was determined to make sure Tilda did too. Don't let her die. Kiva didn't need the reminder from the note anymore. She never had. And as she pulled up a stool beside Tip and held tight to Tilda's hand, she began to retell the tale of how her father met her mother. She hoped that if Tilda had comprehended the story when Kiva had first shared it, and she would have also heard Kiva's pleas for her to remember her own loved ones, to remember that they needed her to stay alive and to fight. "You really care about her, don't you?" Tip asked later that night when Kiva was feeding yet more samples to the rats. The young boy was trying to help, but was more of a hindrance than anything, preferring to play with the vermin than settle them. "About who?" Kiva asked, distracted. "Tilda," Tip said. "I saw the way you looked at her today when you were telling your story. That was great, but by the way, you never talk about your parents." "There's not much to tell," Kiva said, trying for a dismissive tone, if only to ease the ache she felt whenever she thought of the mother and father she'd lost, her sister and brothers too. Tip knew better than to press, so he went back to his original question. "What is it about her, about Tilda, that's still just what she represents, that you don't want another prisoner to die? Not if you can help it. That's what you said, right?" Seeing his curiosity, Kiva found herself answering, "It's that, yes, but," she paused and quietly admitted, "she also reminds me of someone I used to know." Tip turned to face her fully, his blue eyes suddenly lined with tears. I wasn't sure if you'd noticed. I didn't want to say anything, afraid to make a big deal out of it." Kiva dropped the food she was mixing aquifer moss into and moved a step forward toward him. "Tip, I didn't realize when she first arrived, but once you cleaned her up," Tip said quietly, wiping his face, "she reminds me so much of Mama." Kiva opened her arms, an invitation, and he climbed out of the rat pen to embrace her. His tears didn't fall, but his sadness still enveloped them. "Ineke would be proud of you," Kiva told him quietly. "You know that, right? So proud." For the life of her, Kiva had no idea how Tilda reminded her of his departed mother, other than that they were similar ages and had dark hair. Perhaps that was all that was needed to bring the memories to the forefront of Tip's mind. The same had been true for Kiva after her brother had been killed. For years, every young boy she'd seen had reminded her of Karen. I'm really glad you care about her," Tip said. "Even if it's not really Mama, it means a lot to me that you're doing what you can to try and help her." He pushed back from Kiva and shuffled his feet as he admitted, "I know I was upset about you taking on her sentence, but you did the right thing, and you're doing so great with the ordeals. I'm sure tomorrow will be the same." Kiva's insides gave a lurch at the thought of the trial the next day. And then they tightened even further when she realized that if she managed to survive this one, and then the last one, she would be free to leave Zalendorf, she and Tilda and Tip, all of them together. But they'd be leaving behind Jaren and Nari, and Mott too. At the thought of the old man, Kiva's eyes travelled over to her workbench, the small flask of milky liquid waiting there. The ex-apothecary had delivered it that afternoon, having spent the week coming and going from Kiva's medicinal garden, mumbling to himself. Today he'd finally handed the potion over and said, "Drink this tomorrow morning. Don't ask what's in it. Trust me, you don't want to know. Just plug your nose first and you won't get it down." "I'm going to need more information than that," Kiva had replied, eyeing the flask dubiously. "Most people drown from panic or exhaustion, so I'm guessing that's how the ordeal will test you," Mott had told her, "assuming you'll be thrown in the aquifer and made to swim a while. You can swim, right? This brew will help you physically. It'll take you longer to tire. It'll ease any cramps, keep your muscles from seizing up. I tried adding something to keep you calm, but it reacted badly, so you'll have to manage your emotions yourself." With that, he'd wished her luck and told her he'd start thinking of ways to help her with the trial by Earth. Kiva was grateful for his confidence that she'd made it that far, choking up a little as he'd waved and left the infirmary. It wouldn't be easy to leave Mott behind if Kiva survived all 4 ordeals, but as with Jaren, she could do nothing for him. Tip and Tilda, however, were relying on her, even if they didn't know it. Of course I care about her, Kiva replied to the young boy, ignoring everything else going through her mind. And I'm glad you do too. Tip nodded. I really do. You can count on me whenever you're not here. I look after her almost as well as you do. Better, I'll bet, Kiva said, reaching out to brush his floppy red fringe to the side. I'm sure you're her favourite by far. Tip grinned. Well, I didn't want to say anything. Kiva laughed and moved back to her samples. She hadn't returned to the tunnels that afternoon, instead lingering in the infirmary after Tilda fell asleep, waiting to see if she would wake up lucid again. But as anticipated, the ill woman had slipped back into her delirium. Kiva had spent the waiting period testing rats as she normally would have done the following day, but since the ordeal was tomorrow, she didn't want to risk wasting any time. Kiva intended to make a quick trip down to the tunnels with Nari in the morning to collect her final samples. Returning before the trial, the timing would be tight, with them needing to be back at the infirmary for Kiva's summons, but she was confident they'd be able to sneak it in. When the next morning arrived, however, her plans were derailed by the announcement that the prison wagon had just arrived carrying new inmates. As the first point of call for them, Kiva had to remain in the infirmary to check them over and carve their hands, all of which took time, preventing her from collecting her final samples. The only positive was that, with the new arrivals, also kept Kiva distracted, and aside from making sure to ingest Mott's foul-tasting potion, she was barely aware of the minutes ticking down to her ordeal. There were 4 prisoners in total, 3 men, 1 woman, all different ages and colorings hailing from across Wenderall. Each was in good enough health that Kiva knew they hadn't been transported very far on the most recent leg of their journey. Not while there was still nearly 4 weeks left of winter. As it was, Kiva was surprised by their arrival. Only Jaren, his 2 dead companions, and later Tilda had been transported to Salandov since the weather turned. Plus the royal entourage for the first ordeal, but they didn't count since their travel comfort was considerably different from that of the prisoners experienced. One by one, the new arrivals were shuffled over to Kiva, and she checked them, carved them, and sent them on their way, as she had done for years. Tip remained with her, fetching her clean water and handling her pepperroot ash, then helping them all into their new prison clothes. Only the woman dared to say anything to Kiva, grumbling that they'd been forced to make the frozen journey because every dungeon they'd tried to stop at along the way had been filled to capacity. She'd barely gotten the words out before Kiva hushed her, since it wasn't Nari who had delivered the news of their arrival, nor was the amber-eyed woman in the infirmary watching over them. Instead, both Bones and the butcher were lingering by the door, their silence, menace filling the space and urging Kiva to hurry. Finally, she finished with the last of the new arrivals, who was then herded by the 2 snarling guards over to where the others waited, after which they all mercifully left the infirmary, Bones and the butcher included. They were someone else's problem now, Kiva thought, relieved that she hadn't been assigned orientation duties again, unlike with Jaren, though that hadn't worked out too badly in the end. That was intense, Tip said, collecting the discarded clothes and placing them in a pile. I don't know how you do it. Lots of practice, Kiva said, moving to help him. She picked up a dirty tunic that had belonged to one of the men, wrinkling her nose as she shook it out, and then folded it. She nearly missed a small fluttering item that drifted to the floor, nearly didn't act fast enough to cover it with her boot before Tip saw. Her pulse leapt into her throat, but she remained calm, continuing to fold the clothes until they were all done. Can you run these over to the entrance block for sorting? Kiva asked Tip, praying that he didn't notice the waver in her voice. I'll be really fast, he said in answer. They'll be coming to get you soon. I don't want to miss it. Kiva barely spared a thought to how it was nearly time for her next ordeal. All she did was hold her breath until he took off out of the room, after which she glanced around quickly to make sure that she was alone, aside from sleeping Tilda. Once certain, Kiva shifted her foot and bent to pick up the scrap of parchment that had fallen from the man's tunic. This was it, she thought. Her family had received the note she'd sent through Raz, and they'd finally replied to give her news of the coming rescue. With shaking hands, she unfolded the message. It was one word, the code scrawled, this time in her brother's messy, hurried hand. And it's just one line of symbols. Kiva frowned, reading it again, wondering if she was if she was mistranslating. It was a name, a town, Oak Hollow. If she recalled her basic geography lessons, it was down south, close to Valenia. But why would he... Kiva sucked in a breath as understanding hit her. Her brother was telling her where he was, where her family was, where she could come and find them, if she survived the ordeals, if she earned her freedom. It filled her with hope, with warmth that he believed she could triumph, where so many others had failed. And yet that hope dissolved as devastation overcame her. Her third trial was today, and they still weren't there to save her. She told them that she needed a rescue, and this was their only reply. We are coming. Lies. All lies. Because they weren't coming. She drew in a deep breath, seeking to control the tears that wanted to spring from her eyes. She couldn't blame them. No one had ever broken into Zalandov. No one had ever escaped. She knew it had been an impossible task, an impossible ask, but she'd hoped. With the help of the rebels, she'd hoped. It didn't matter. It was up to Kiva now. If she wanted to see her family again, she would have to make her own way to them. Her brother's note told her two things. They were waiting for her. They wanted her to join them. 2 more weeks, 2 more ordeals. Then she could be free. Then she would be free. Oh, sweets, you're still here. Kiva scrunched up the note and kicked it under the bench before spinning around to find Alicia, walking through the infirmary door. What are you doing here? Kiva asked, her voice hoarse with all that she was feeling. Alicia patted the rucksack she held, the tinkling sound indicating shifting glass, and answered, Just came to top up the supplies. Kiva blinked. Supplies? Alicia headed over to the work table and knelt before it, opening a panel at the front. Kiva gaped, having never realized there was a cupboard built into the wood. Supplies, Alicia replied, reaching into her bag and pulling out a vial of clear liquid, waving it at Kiva. You know, the immunity booster. A cold feeling gripped Kiva as she walked on numb legs toward the other woman. Immunity booster? Mm-hmm, Alicia said, her voice muffled from her head being half in the cupboard, as she cleared a space around the other identical vials that were already in there. I wish I wasn't allergic to goldenroot. Nurgle too, otherwise we'd be downing these by the bucketful. Kiva cleared her throat. Can I see one of those, please? Alicia was just about to place a new vial in the cupboard, but she instead handed it to Kiva and reached for another one, continuing to fill the space. With a shaking hand, Kiva unstopped the lid, raising the vial to her nose. One whiff was all it took for panic to seize her, but she forced her voice to remain steady as she asked, Where did you get these, Alicia? The woman asked, distracted by her task. These vials, where did they come from? Nurgle gave them to me, sweets, Alicia said. He's heading out with the others to watch your trial, but my nerves can't take that. I offered to drop them off since I was on my way here anyway. Someone has to watch over the patients while you're gone. Nurgle gave you these immunity boosters? Well, yes, Alicia said, and something in Kiva's voice made her pause what she was doing and look up at her. But he got them from someone else. We've been handing them out all winter. Anytime someone comes in here and see us, we make them take one, just like you do. What? Alicia's brow furrowed. You have been giving them out, haven't you? When Kiva shook her head slowly, horror began to coil within her. Alicia frowned fully and said, "You should know better, dear. With this sickness going around, we need all the help we can get. Not everyone is allergic to goldenroot. You of all people should have been shoving these down the throats of your patients, not the sick ones. We tried that, and it only made them worse. But the people who come here with wounds or colds or the healthy ones, they're the ones we've been giving the boosters to, trying to give them a fighting chance, as you should have been doing." Alicia's lips pressed together. "I'm disappointed in you, Kiva." But Kiva had stopped listening. Instead, she was hearing Cresta's voice, her accusations from just yesterday. "Everyone who comes to see you for the smallest thing ends up getting sick. Explain that, healer. Everworld helped them." Kiva knew what was causing the sickness. Alicia was right, there was goldenroot in the vial, a natural immunity booster. But Alicia was also wrong, because there wasn't only goldenroot in the vial. The smell was still lingering in the back of Kiva's nose, bitter almonds with a hint of rotting fruit. The spicy goldenroot almost masked it, enough that the untrained healers like Alicia and Nurgle wouldn't know. Her fever-dilated pupils, headache, vomiting, diarrhea, high fever, dilated pupils, headache, vomiting, diarrhea, stomach rash, they were all symptoms of a stomach sickness, but they were also classic side effects of something else, something that smelled of bitter almonds and rotting fruit. Wraithweed, and more commonly known as Death's Embrace, the immunity booster. It wasn't medicine, it was poison. The prisoners weren't catching any illness, they were being given one. Time to go. Kiva spun away from Alicia and toward the infirmary door, the shock of what she just realized causing trembles to overtake her body. "Where's Nari?" Kiva choked out at the sight of Warden Rook striding toward her. The man raised a dark brow. "You've become quite familiar with her, haven't you? Be careful, healer." Kiva stared at him, still reeling from what she'd learned. She'd opened her mouth to tell Rook, but then saw the guards with him, one who had walked in at his side, the others standing just beyond the doorway and within hearing range. Alicia's words came to her again. He got them from someone else. Kiva couldn't risk giving away what she'd discovered, not until she was certain the person responsible would be caught. Alicia and Nurgle had been nothing but these pawns, nothing more than pawns, idiotic pawns, but pawns nonetheless. Until their supplier was revealed, Kiva had to be careful who she told. She couldn't just blurt out the truth to Warden Rook, not while others were listening. The prisoners weren't the only gossips at Salandov. The rumour mill ran rampant among the guards too, and words always travelled back to the inmates. This needed to be taken care of, but quietly. Salandov was already a powder keg waiting to explode. If people discovered that the illness wasn't an illness, that someone was deliberately poisoning them. "What's that you've got there?" Rook said, peering at the liquid in Kiva's white-knuckled grip. Kiva sought a calmness she didn't feel, lying through her teeth, as she handed the vial back to Alicia and said, "Nothing important." Rook's eyes narrowed, and Kiva felt a spark of hope, knowing how good he was at reading people. Surely he would recognize the panic on her features, enough to see that something was wrong, and demand a private audience with her. Then she could tell him the truth, without listening ears. But he said nothing, oblivious to all she was thinking and feeling. All he did was turn away and gesture for her to follow. "Come, we've a walk ahead of us." "Wait," she cried, unable to stop herself. "Can I have a quick word, alone?" Rook's strides didn't even slow as he called out over his shoulder, "We're running late. Whatever it is can wait until after your trial." "If you're still alive," snickered the guard who had walked in with him, stepping closer to Kiva and giving her a hearty shove forward. "Move, healer, but—" "Walk or I'll carry you," the guard shoved again. "Your choice." Kiva ground her teeth together but stomped obediently toward the door, silently cursing Rook for not seeing how desperate she was to speak with him. Her thoughts spiraled as she stepped outside, the still snickering guard speeding up to flank the warden alongside 2 others. A further 3 joined them on the path, but none were Nari. Kiva was desperate to see her and share what she'd learned, certain that Nari, unlike the warden, would listen, and confident that the guard would know what action to take. People were dying because of a poison. Someone needed to know, needed to figure out who was behind it and bring them to justice. Kiva's first thought was Cresta. If inmates were able to get their hands on smuggled angel dust, then other items could be obtained too, especially by the leader of the prison rebels. But Cresta had seemed so enraged when she'd confronted Kiva yesterday, claiming that her friends were getting sick and dying. If she wasn't the one supplying the poison, then surely she'd have kept it from harming those she cared about. It had to be someone else, some motive other than to spread fear and animosity, which Cresta didn't need a poison to do. But who? Kiva's concentration unravelled when a voice called out for the warden, prompting their small group to pause. She was so relieved to turn and find Nari striding toward them that her knees nearly gave out. "Arel," Rook grunted. "I wondered where you were. Did you know the infirmary was left unguarded?" "A wagon came in this morning," Nari said. "I was told it was covered." The warden's lips tightened, but her answer must have satisfied him, since he continued walking. Kiva didn't follow until Nari nudged her forward, and even then she trailed as far back from the warden and his entourage as possible. "I need to talk to you," Kiva whispered from the corner of her mouth. "You need to focus," Nari whispered back. Kiva's eyes flicked sidelong toward the guard, noting her pallid expression, her tense features, the anxious way she was holding herself. "It's urgent," Kiva whispered. "It's about—" But Kiva cut herself off when she realized that something was wrong. They weren't walking towards the tunnel entrance, towards the aquifer. They were walking towards Arlendov's gates. Suddenly, all thoughts of the poison fled her mind, fear overtaking her as she remembered she was about to face her 3rd ordeal, and it could very well end in her death. She'd been nervously confident while thinking she would have to swim across the aquifer, especially with Mott's energy potion flooding her veins. But now she had no idea what was happening. "Where are we going?" Kiva whispered. Nari's tone was as grim as her face when she replied, "I don't know, but I don't like this." Kiva didn't like it either, but as they walked through the gates behind Rook, followed the rail tracks past the farms, and continued on, she began to get an inkling of where they might be headed. Saliva pooled in her mouth, and more than ever she felt a frantic need to share what she'd learned, so she reached for Nari's leather sleeve and leaned into it. "It's poison." "What?" the guard asked before giving a swift hand gesture indicating silence, just as Rook turned around to look at them. "Keep up," the warden said. "Everyone's waiting for us." Kiva knew he was referring to the rest of Zalendorf's inhabitants. She wondered if Tip had been ushered away with the crowd on his way back from the entrance block, hoping he was with Mott or Jaron, and not lost among the sea of burly lumbersmiths or quarry workers. But she also knew the young boy could fend for himself, so she chose not to worry about him, and instead sought to make sure Nari had comprehended her message. Rook, however, had now noticed they were lagging behind, and slowed his steps, forcing them to catch up. When Kiva looked over at Nari, she didn't seem alarmed, revealing that she hadn't understood what Kiva had said, or the importance of it. She needed to find a way to explain that and fast. But then Rook turned off the main rail track line, heading further east somewhere Kiva had never travelled before, and she realized she was right about where they were taking her, her heart leaping into her throat with the dreaded confirmation: the abandoned quarry, a flooded death trap, the perfect place for her trial by water. Bum, bum, bum. We're on page 306. Ooh, we're 75% of the way done. We're 3/4 done. We only have a quarter left. And it is getting good. And once again, we're going to leave on a cliffhanger. And we'll have to find out next week what's going to happen in the trial by ordeal, the water one. So I think that is about all that I need to say. I feel like we're doing pretty good with our cookies so far. I've got everything. I've got at least one of everything. We'll work our way up. Next time we'll get that shipment of cookies up to 100, and then work on the alchemy lab and the portal and the time machine and the antimatter condenser and all that. We'll get those up towards 100, and then we'll get the cursor up to 150, and then go down and try and get the rest up to 150 from there. So we'll just sort of go up like that. But thank you all for watching this week's stream, and I hope you guys have a good week, and we will see you again on Monday for another episode of Sharky playing Pokemon. So thank you all for watching, and we will see you then.